Everything you have been told about the Knights Templar is a carefully constructed lie. For 9 centuries, the world has whispered of their gold, their hidden treasures, and their lost maps. But the gold was a distraction. The real secret was far more dangerous. A truth so corrosive that the Vatican spent 300 years burning every man who had seen it. In the winter of 1118, 9 men descended into the dark beneath the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. They were not looking for the Holy Grail. They were looking for the reason why God had gone silent. What they found, buried under 30 feet of dust and ancient stone, was not a treasure, but an absence. They found the second gospel, the gospel of the void, which proved that the world we inhabit is not a creation, but a mistake. This is the forbidden knowledge that corrupted their bloodline and turned holy warriors into masters of the dark. This is the truth the king buried and the church tried to erase from the memory of man. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Forget the world outside your window. Imagine the cold, damp stone of the 12th century. The flicker of a single candle against the obsidian dark. We are going back to the beginning, to the moment the shovel hit the floor of the world. The year was 1118. The city of Jerusalem was a jagged crown of white stone under a sun that felt like a judgment. The First Crusade had ended, leaving behind a kingdom built on blood and fragile hope. While other knights sought land and titles, 9 men, led by the quiet and intense Hugo de Payens, asked for something much stranger. They asked King Baldwin II for the right to live within the ruins of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The site where the Temple of Solomon once stood, dot to the outside world. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. They wore ragged clothes and shared a single horse between 2 men. But inside the dark halls of the temple, their poverty was a mask. For 7 long years they did not guard the roads. They did not fight the Saracens. Instead, they dug. Imagine the sound of iron hitting limestone in the dead of night. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink of the pickaxe echoing through the subterranean vaults. The air in those tunnels was old, heavy with the weight of thousands of years of silence. There was no oxygen, only the smell of salt and the stale breath of the earth. These men were not archaeologists. They were seekers of a terrifying clarity. Hugo de Payens would stand at the entrance of the shaft, holding a torch high. His eyes were not on the walls, but on the shadows. He knew that beneath the holy city lay a geography of secrets. The Temple of Solomon was not just a house of prayer, it was a vault designed to keep something out of the light. As the months turned into years, the 9 knights became shadows themselves. They grew thin. Their skin turned the color of the limestone they worked. They spoke in whispers, terrified that if they raised their voices, the weight of the mountain above them would come crashing down to silence them forever. They were digging toward a specific point, a location marked on a map that had been smuggled out of a hidden library in Alexandria. It was a spot where the foundations of the world supposedly met the architecture of the divine. But as they went deeper, the information they gathered began to change them. They found artifacts that did not belong to the history of the Bible. They found strange, geometric carvings in the deep bedrock that predated the Hebrews, predated the Egyptians, and seemed to mock the very idea of human time. One night, in the 7th year of their excavation, the ground beneath the pickaxe of André de Montbard gave way. It was not a collapse, but an opening, a perfect circular hole into a void that seemed to breathe. The air that rushed out was ice-cold, smelling of nothingness. Not rot, not earth, just a pure, terrifying void, the 9 knights gathered around the hole. They did not speak. In the flickering light of their torches, they looked at one another and saw the same expression, a mixture of religious awe and primal dread. They had spent 7 years in the dark to reach this moment, yet now that the door was open, the weight of their mission felt like a leaden shroud. Hugo de Payens was the first to descend. He tied a rope of rough hemp around his waist and lowered himself into the blackness. As he sank, the sounds of the world above, the wind, the distant prayers from the mosque, the shuffling feet of his brothers all vanished. He was entering a space where time seemed to have no meaning. When his boots finally touched the floor, he was in a chamber that defied every law of medieval architecture. The walls were not made of stone blocks, but of a single, continuous sheet of dark, translucent material that looked like frozen water. It was obsidian, but it was warmer to the touch. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into the gloom, and the floor was perfectly smooth, polished to a mirror finish. As Hugo raised his torch, the light did not reflect. It was swallowed. The chamber seemed to eat the flame, leaving only a small, dim circle of visibility around him. In the center of this room sat a simple stone plinth. On top of it was not a golden box, not the tablets of the law, and not a holy relic of the cross. It was a single scroll, wrapped in a casing of lead and sealed with a substance that looked like dried blood. Hugo reached out, his hand trembling. He was a man who had killed in the name of God. He had seen the walls of Jerusalem fall. He was not a man of fear, but as his fingers brushed the lid casing, he felt a jolt of cold lightning. It was a psychic shock, a realization that everything he believed about the nature of the soul was a lie. He brought the scroll back to the surface. For 3 days and 3 nights, the 9 knights stayed in the tunnels. They did not eat. They did not sleep. They huddled around a single oil lamp and broke the seal. They were the first men in a millennium to read the words of the second gospel. It was not written in Hebrew or Greek or Latin. It was written in a language of symbols that seemed to speak directly to the mind, bypassing the ears. As they read, the history of the world began to unspool before their eyes. The scroll spoke of a time before the sun, a time when there was only a great silence. It described the creation not as an act of love, but as an accident, a fracture in the silence that trapped pieces of the divine in cages of flesh and bone. The moral decay began that very night. If the world was a mistake, then there was no sin. If the Creator was not a father, but a distant, unfeeling force that had forgotten its own accident, then the church in Rome was nothing more than a theater of shadows. The knights looked at their white mantles and saw them for what they were, costumes. They looked at their swords and saw them as tools for a god that wasn't listening. This was the nothing they had discovered. Not a lack of treasure, but the discovery that the spiritual foundation of Europe was a void. They realized that if they revealed this truth, the world would collapse. The peasants would stop working the fields. The kings would lose their divine right. The very fabric of human society would tear apart. They had a choice: to destroy the scroll and return to their lives, or to become the keepers of the lie. They chose the latter. But the secret was a parasite. It began to eat them from the inside out. They grew colder, more calculated. They realized that power was the only thing that mattered in a world without a soul. They would use the church's own structures to build an empire of their own, a shadow empire that would protect the secret while they sought a way to escape the cage. The scroll had described, this is why they became the bankers of Europe. This is why they built cathedrals with hidden geometries. They were not building houses of God, they were building laboratories for the study of the void. Every archway, every stained glass window, and every cryptic carving in a Templar church was a piece of the puzzle they were trying to solve. The puzzle of how to unmake the world. As the years passed, the 9 knights returned to Europe, but they were no longer the men who had left. They were silent, brooding figures who seemed to look through people rather than at them. They carried the weight of the void in their eyes. When they stood before the Pope to receive their official recognition, they knelt and kissed the ring of the fisherman, but in their hearts they were laughing. They saw the golden robes and the incense and the Latin prayers as a grand, absurd comedy. They were the only ones who knew the stage was empty, but carrying such a secret requires a moral compromise that eventually rots the heart. To keep the world believing in the lie, the Templars had to become the ultimate deceivers. They began to recruit, but they did not look for the most pious men. They looked for the most intelligent, the most broken, and the most ambitious. The initiation rituals changed. Behind closed doors in the dead of night, the new recruits were not taught the Bible. They were taught the negative theology. They were shown the obsidian chamber in their minds. They were told that the cross was not a symbol of salvation, but a symbol of the 4 walls of the prison. The American and Tier 1 audiences who value information will find interest in the historical records of the time. Records from the trials in the 1400s describe witnesses who claimed the Templars would spit on the cross during their private ceremonies. History tells us this was a false confession forced by torture. But what if it wasn't? What if they spat on the cross not because they worshipped the devil, but because they hated the prison it represented? The psychological decay was profound. Imagine a man who believes that nothing he does matters, yet he must act as if everything is holy. This creates a split in the psyche, a darkness that must find an outlet. The Templar commanderies became places of strange, quiet experiments. They studied the limits of pain, the limits of the mind, and the alchemy of the soul. They were searching for a key mentioned in the second gospel. The scroll had hinted that while the world was a prison, there was a way to decreate the self and return to the great silence. They became obsessed with this exit. All their wealth, all their castles, all their influence was directed toward this one goal. They began to treat the rest of humanity as cattle, useful only for funding their search for the exit. This is the moral failure that the Church eventually sensed. The Vatican didn't fear the Templars' wealth. They feared the Templars' indifference. The Church survives on the idea that every soul is precious and every sin must be confessed. The Templars, however, had moved beyond sin. They were operating in a reality where the rules of men and the rules of the Church were irrelevant. In the long, candlelit nights of the 13th century, in the stone fortresses of France and England, the Grand Masters would sit alone with the lead case scroll. They would read the symbols until their eyes bled. They were looking for the formula to break the world. The common people saw them as heroes, the defenders of the faith. But the knights looked down from their horses and felt only a cold, distant pity. They knew the peasants were praying to a shadow. They knew the kings were fighting for dirt. And they knew that eventually the secret would become too heavy to hold. The void was not a static thing. It was growing. The more people who learned of the secret, the more the nothingness seemed to bleed into the physical world. Strange things began to happen in the lands owned by the Templars. Crops would fail in perfect geometric patterns. The air would grow cold for no reason. People would report hearing a sound like a distant, endless scream. Coming from deep within the earth, the knights knew what it was. The accident of creation was beginning to fray at the edges because they were pulling at the threads. They were close to finding the key. They were close to opening the door they had found beneath the Temple of Solomon, but they were not the only ones watching. The King of France, Philip the Fair, was a man of cold ambition, but he was also a man who feared what he couldn't control. He didn't want the Templars' gold. He wanted to know why they no longer feared him. He wanted to know why they looked at his throne as if it were made of straw. He began to plant spies within the order. He began to listen to the whispers of the disillusioned brothers, and what he heard terrified him more than any army. The spies returned with stories of the Black Mass, but they were describing it incorrectly. They were seeing the Templars' rituals through the lens of their own superstition. They didn't understand that the knights weren't calling out to a demon. They were calling out to the silence. Philip the Fair realized that if this secret got out, his kingdom would vanish in a day. Not because of a war, but because the people would simply stop believing in the reality of the crown. He saw the moral decay of the order, but he also saw his own destruction. The trap was being set. The hammers were being forged. The date was chosen, a Friday in October that would live in infamy for 1,000 years. But the Templars in their cold, analytical towers already knew it was coming. They had read the scroll. They knew that the prison always fights back when a prisoner tries to pick the lock. The question was, would they hide the scroll? Or would they use the fire of their own execution to ignite the secret and burn the world to the ground? The torches were already being lit in the streets of Paris. The king's men were sharpening their blades. But inside the temple, the knights were doing something far more terrifying. They were preparing to let the nothing out. In our next chapter, we will witness the night the shadow fell, the true reason the Templars went to the stake without a fight, and the terrifying discovery the king's men made when they finally broke into the Grand Master's private vault. The gold was gone, but something else was waiting for them in the dark. When the fleet of the temple finally touched the docks of Marseille, the people expected hymns of victory. They expected holy warriors who would weep and kiss the Christian soil. Instead, they found iron-cold statues. The knights who stepped off those ships did not carry the cross in their hearts anymore. They carried a secret that had burned the divinity out of them. A forbidden truth found beneath the ruins of the East. They had looked into the empty eyes of the second gospel and realized that the church they served was a magnificent lie built on a foundation of sand. These were no longer holy men. They were apostates of the soul, silent rebels who had stopped praying because they knew there was no one left in the heavens to hear them. This was a spiritual plague, a moral decay that began in the shadows of Jerusalem and now threatened to consume the very fabric of Europe. They brought back an absence, a void that was more dangerous than any sword. This is the truth the king buried, the secret that turned the defenders of Christ into the architects of his destruction. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn against the world, and the only sound is the rhythmic heartbeat of a dying fire. Let your mind drift back to the year 1127, to the cold winds of the Mediterranean and the heavy, crushing weight of silent iron. The journey back from the Holy Land was not a voyage of triumph. It was a funeral procession for the spirit. The ships, scarred by salt and battle, moved across the water like ghosts. On deck, the knights stood in perfect, terrifying silence. In the years before, they had been known for their constant chanting of the Psalms. Their voices used to rise above the crashing waves, a wall of sound meant to keep the darkness at bay. But now, as the French coastline appeared on the horizon, there was only the sound of the wind snapping against the sails. Hugo de Payens stood at the prow of the lead vessel. His white mantle, once a symbol of purity, was stained with the gray dust of the tunnels. His eyes were fixed on the shore, but he was not seeing the green hills of his home. He was seeing the obsidian chamber. He was feeling the weight of the lead case scroll hidden in his cabin. Among the crew, the sailors began to whisper. They noticed that the knights no longer gathered for the morning mass. They noticed that the chaplains of the order, men who had spent their lives in prayer, now sat staring at their hands as if they were made of glass. When the sun set, the knights did not cross themselves. They did not look to the east. They looked down into the dark water, as if they were searching for something they had lost in the deep. This was the beginning of the psychological shift. To an American or Tier 1 audience, this is the moment of the great disconnect. Imagine a group of elite soldiers today returning from a war not with trauma, but with a new, terrifying understanding of physics that makes their previous lives seem like a dream. This was the medieval equivalent. The knights had been hollowed out. The void they found in Jerusalem had replaced their faith when they finally disembarked. The local clergy were waiting with incense and bells. They began the Te Deum, the great hymn of praise. But as the knights marched past, they did not bow. They did not remove their helmets. They walked with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that felt more like clockwork than human movement. The Bishop of Marseille later wrote in a private letter that it felt as if a winter frost had entered the city in the middle of July. He described the knights' auras not as holy, but as profoundly empty. This emptiness was not a lack of emotion. It was a presence. It was the presence of the secret. The knights moved inland toward the great commanderies of France. But as they traveled, the rumors began to grow like shadows at dusk. In every town they passed, the stories were the same. The Templars would enter a village, pay for their supplies with gold that seemed too pure for the age, and refuse to enter the local church. The most shocking incident occurred in the Cathedral of Troyes. It was a cold autumn morning, and the local nobility had gathered to welcome the heroes. The air inside the cathedral was thick with the smell of beeswax and expensive lilac. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting pools of ruby and sapphire light onto the stone floor. When Hugo de Payens and his 8 companions entered, the music stopped. The congregation held its breath. This was the moment of the great refusal. As the priest raised the host, the bread that was supposed to be the body of Christ, every knight in the room turned his back. There was a collective gasp. In the 12th century, this was more than an insult. It was a cosmic betrayal. It was a declaration that the ritual had no power over them. The priest's hand trembled. The incense burner swung into a halt. For a long minute, the only sound was the breathing of 100 terrified people. Hugo de Payens looked up at the crucifix, hanging above the altar. To everyone else, it was the symbol of the world's salvation. To him, after reading the second gospel, it was a symbol of the great trap. He saw the nails not as iron, but as the anchors of the soul to the prison of matter. He did not feel anger. He felt a cold, distant pity for the people kneeling in the pews. They were praying to a shadow, and he was the man who had seen the sun go out. The knights turned and walked out of the cathedral before the service was finished. They did not offer an explanation. They did not seek forgiveness. They simply disappeared into the gray mist of the morning dot. From that day on, the Templars began to change the way they lived. They stopped building their chapels in the traditional rectangular shape. Instead, they began to build them as circles. To the uninitiated, this was a tribute to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But the secret truth was different. A circle has no beginning and no end. It is a symbol of a loop, a cage, a cycle of existence that the second gospel taught them to break. Inside these circular chapels, the prayers changed. If you had stood outside the heavy oak doors at midnight, you would not have heard the melodic Gregorian chants. You would have heard a low, discordant humming. It was a sound that didn't follow the laws of music. It was a frequency, a vibration designed to resonate with the stone walls. Creating a psychological state of sensory deprivation, the knights were practicing what they called the unlearning. They were trying to erase the religious programming of their childhoods. They were stripping away the layers of God and Satan to reach the raw, cold static of the void beneath. This was the moral decay that would eventually lead to their downfall. When you stop believing in a higher judgment, you become your own God. And when 9 men become their own gods, they become the most dangerous force on earth. As the knights stopped praying, they started counting. This is the transition that defines the Templar legacy in the eyes of history. They became the first international bankers. But for the Lore Slumber Collective, the question is not how they did it, but why. If you believe that the physical world is a mistake, a prison designed to distract the soul, then you realize that the only way to navigate the prison is to control its resources. Gold, land, and debt were the tools of the jailers. The Templars decided they would become the masters of those tools. They began to develop a system of credit that allowed a pilgrim to deposit money in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem. They created a network of fortresses that were more secure than any king's treasury. But the vaults of the Templars held more than just coins. In the deepest levels, beneath the ledgers and the chests of silver, were the archives of the nothing. They were gathering information. Every piece of land they bought was checked for ancient ruins. Every scroll they confiscated was searched for hidden symbols. They were looking for more pieces of the puzzle they had found in Jerusalem. They were looking for the other gospels of the absence. The psychological shift was complete. They were no longer warriors for Christ. They were the silent managers of a world they no longer respected. They looked at the kings of Europe and saw children playing with wooden swords. They looked at the Pope and saw a man wearing a crown of straw. Their power grew because they were the only ones who weren't afraid of death. Most men in the Middle Ages lived in constant terror of hell. The Templars, however, had learned that hell was not a pit of fire. Hell was the continuation of life. Hell was being reborn into the prison over and over again. Once you lose the fear of judgment, you gain a terrifying freedom. This freedom allowed them to do things other men would find impossible. They could kill without guilt. They could lie without hesitation. They could build an empire that spanned continents while remaining completely isolated from the humanity they lived among. They began to recruit men of science, men who were disillusioned with the Church's dogma. These men became the secret brothers. They were the ones who analyzed the obsidian mirror and the leaden scroll. They were the ones who began to notice that the world was indeed fraying. Around the Templar strongholds. In the commanderies of the Lengic region, villagers began to report strange sights. They saw knights standing on the battlements for hours, staring at the stars, not in prayer, but in calculation. They saw lights in the windows of the chapels that did not flicker like candles, but glowed with a steady, unnatural blue hue. The silence of the Templars became a weapon. In the royal courts, a Templar advisor was a figure of dread. They would sit in the shadows, never speaking unless spoken to, their eyes cold and unblinking. They were the masters of the pause, the masters of the unspoken threat. They knew that everyone else was hiding a sin, while they had simply moved beyond the concept of sin itself. But the void is not a quiet neighbor. It demands more space. The more the Templars focused on the nothing, the more the nothing began to manifest in their physical reality. The Knights began to experience a collective psychological collapse. Some would go blind for no medical reason. Others would lose the ability to speak, their tongues becoming heavy and useless. They were becoming like the obsidian walls of the chamber they had discovered. Smooth, dark, and impenetrable, the world was changing. The elite warriors of the cross had become the ghosts of the counting house. They had traded their prayers for power, and their souls for a secret that was beginning to swallow them whole. The church began to notice the silence. The king began to notice the gold, and the people began to notice the shadows. The moral decay of the order was no longer a secret hidden in the tunnels of Jerusalem. It was a darkness that was visible in the way they walked, the way they looked, and the way they refused to bow to anything human or divine. The psychological shift was finished. The Templars were ready to enact the next phase of the second gospel. They had the wealth, they had the land, and they had the silence. But the void they had invited into the world was starting to demand a sacrifice that would eventually lead to a betrayal so vast it would change the map of Europe forever. In our next chapter, we will look at the first cracks in the armor. We will see the strange signs that began to appear in the streets of Paris, and the growing unease of a king who realized he was no longer the most powerful man in his own palace. Something was moving in the dark, something the Templars had brought back with them, and it was finally starting to wake up. The date Friday the 13th was not born from a simple superstition. It was forged in a moment of supreme religious panic. On that cold morning in 1307, the most powerful military force in Christendom was betrayed not by an enemy on the battlefield, but by the very man who claimed to hold the keys to heaven. Pope Clement V did not order the mass arrest of the Knights Templar because of their wealth, their pride, or their influence. He ordered it because he had received a final, terrifying message from the Grand Master in the dead of night. The Templars had found proof that the afterlife was an empty hall, a silent void that made every prayer, every sacrifice, and every tithe a meaningless gesture. If this forbidden secret reached the masses, the church would not just lose its gold, it would lose its reason to exist. The concept of heaven was dying in the hands of the knights, and the Pope had to kill the messengers before they could bury the divine. This was a desperate, bloody lie meant to protect a crumbling reality from the truth of the void. It was a curse placed upon the calendar to hide a moral decay that threatened to erase the soul of Europe. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn against the world, and the only sound is the rhythmic heartbeat of a dying fire. Let your mind drift back to the autumn of 1307, to the narrow, mist-choked streets of Paris and the heavy, suffocating silence of the Vatican. The year 1307 was a time of shadow and iron. In the heart of France, King Philip IV, known as the Fair, sat upon a throne that was physically magnificent but financially hollow. He was a man of cold, calculated ambition, a man who viewed the world as a game of levers and pulleys. But he was also a man haunted by a debt he could never repay. The Knights Templar had funded his wars, his infrastructure, and his very lifestyle. He owed them his crown, and in the world of kings, gratitude is often replaced by resentment. Yet, Philip's greed was only half of the story. The true engine of the catastrophe was the man in the white robes, Pope Clement V. History often portrays Clement as a weak puppet of the French king, a sickly man suffering from chronic, digestive ailments who moved the papacy to Avignon to escape the chaos of Rome. But the secret records of the Lore Slumber archives suggest a different motive for his agitation. Clement was not just physically ill, he was spiritually terrified. For months, he had been receiving reports from the Templar commanderies that described a new kind of initiation. The reports didn't speak of devil worship in the way the public trials would later claim. They spoke of a ritual of silence. They spoke of knights who, after entering the inner sanctum of the order, stopped attending the sacraments. They spoke of a second gospel that rendered the Pope's authority irrelevant to an American or Tier 1 audience. Imagine a corporation that discovers its entire product is a placebo, yet continues to sell it to billions. The Church was that corporation, and the Templars were the whistleblowers who have found the evidence that the product didn't exist. On the night of October 12th, 1307, the air in Paris was unusually still. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. In a small candlelit room in the Palais de la Cite, King Philip met with his closest advisor, Guillaume de Nogaret. They had already sent out the sealed letters to every seneschal and bailiff in France. The instructions were precise. The letters were not to be opened until dawn on Friday, October 13th. Philip was not looking at the maps of the Templar properties. He was looking at a single piece of parchment that had been delivered by a defecting knight. It wasn't a map of gold. It was a diagram of a human soul being unmade. It was a description of the void. If they are allowed to speak, Nogaret whispered, the candlelight dancing in his dark eyes, there will be no more kings. There will be no more priests. There will only be the silence they found in the East. Philip nodded. He was not a man of faith, but he was a man of order. He understood that a world without the hope of heaven was a world that could not be governed. The Templars had committed the ultimate sin. They had found the truth in a world that survived on a lie. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the king's men-at-arms began to move through the streets. They wore soft leather boots to muffle their steps. They carried heavy iron shackles and torches that remained unlit. They moved like the shadows of a coming plague. At the Temple of Paris, the great fortress that housed the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, the knights were asleep. Or perhaps they weren't. Some accounts suggest that the inner circle of the order knew exactly what was coming. They had read the stars. They had read the scroll. They knew that the nothing they had embraced required a transition through fire. The betrayal was total. It was a surgical strike against the very men who had protected the Holy Land for 200 years. But as the king's men surrounded the walls, they felt a strange, cold vibration emanating from the stone. It was the frequency of the void, the sound of a secret that was about to be buried alive. Dawn broke over France with a pale, sickly light. Across the kingdom, hundreds of local officials broke the wax seals on their secret orders. The language was intentionally inflammatory. It accused the Templars of spitting on the cross, of ritualized indecency, and of worshipping a mysterious head known as Baphomet. These were the viral lies of the 14th century, designed to turn a pious population against their protectors, but as the soldiers burst into the commanderies, they encountered something they didn't expect. There was no resistance. The elite warriors of the age, men who had faced the armies of Saladin without flinching, simply stood up and held out their wrists for the chains. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was arrested in his private quarters. He did not reach for his sword. He looked at the soldiers with a gaze that was so detached, so empty of fear, that the captain of the guard reportedly had to look away. De Molay was not a man being captured. He was a man who had already departed. In the Vatican, Pope Clement waited for the messenger. He sat in his private chapel, surrounded by the relics of 1,000 years of faith. He was praying, but not to the God of his youth. He was praying that the fire would be enough to consume the evidence. He was terrified that the absence found by the Templars would leak out of their prisons and into the minds of the people. To the informative mind, the arrest of the Templars represents a pivot point in Western psychology. It was the moment the state and the church collaborated to lobotomize a part of human curiosity. They had to frame the Knights as evil because they couldn't explain that the Knights were actually informed. The moral decay was not in the Templars' rituals, but in the church's reaction. To protect the concept of heaven, they had to create a literal hell on earth for the Knights. They used the Inquisition's most brutal methods, not to extract a confession of guilt, but to break the Knights' connection to the void. They wanted them to scream, to cry out to a god they no longer believed in. Imagine the sound of the iron doors slamming shut in 100 different dungeons. The clink of the chains against the damp stone, the smell of vinegar and old blood in the interrogation rooms. The Knights were stripped of their white mantles, the red cross torn from their chests. They were left in the dark, the very element they had studied for so long. But the silence in the dungeons was different from the silence in the tunnels of Jerusalem. In the tunnels, the silence was a mystery. In the dungeons, the silence was a weapon. The king's interrogators were frustrated. They wanted stories of treasure maps and secret alliances with the Sultan. Instead, they got descriptions of the uncreated light. They got philosophical riddles about the emptiness of the cup. King Philip grew impatient. He needed the gold to pay his debts, but his men couldn't find it. The vast treasury of the Paris temple was missing. The ledgers spoke of gold, but the vaults held only empty air and the faint scent of copper. This only fueled the king's paranoia. He believed the Templars had used their secret science to hide the wealth in a different dimension. Or perhaps they had smuggled it out on the ships that had vanished from the harbor of La Rochelle. The night before, the church's panic reached a fever pitch. If the Templars could hide gold, they could hide the truth. Pope Clement issued a papal bull, Pastoralis Preeminentia, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars and seize their lands. He was trying to cast a net across the entire world to catch a ghost. But as the trials began, a strange phenomenon started to affect the inquisitors. Those who spent too much time listening to the Templars' confessions began to experience a profound sense of despair. They began to question their own faith. They began to see the absence in the crucifixes they held. The moral decay was spreading like a psychic contagion. The church had attempted to cauterize the wound by burning the Knights, but they were only spreading the ashes of the void into the wind. Inside the cells, the Knights began to practice a form of mental escape. They would sit in the darkness, their eyes closed, and visualized the obsidian chamber. They were using the psychological techniques found in the second gospel to dissociate from their physical pain. They were unmaking their bodies before the inquisitors could do it for them. This is why the records show so few Templars actually resisted or tried to escape. They weren't broken by the church. They had already moved beyond the reach of human suffering. They were waiting for the final act of the play. They knew that the Friday the 13th deception was not the end of their story, but the beginning of their transformation into a myth. That would haunt the Western mind forever, as the years of the trial dragged on. The physical world seemed to reflect the inner decay of the institutions that had betrayed the order. Europe entered a period of cold, wet summers and failed harvests. The Great Famine was beginning. To the people of the time, it felt as if God had indeed turned his face away. In the Vatican, Pope Clement's health continued to decline. He was haunted by dreams of Jacques de Molay standing in the center of a void, holding out the lead case scroll. Every time the Pope tried to read the scroll in his dreams, the letters would turn into black smoke and fill his lungs. He was suffocating on the secret he had tried to bury. King Philip was also suffering. His victory over the Templars had brought him no gold, only more debt and a reputation for cruelty that even his own subjects found distasteful. He had destroyed the most effective military and financial system in the world, and in its place he found only a vacuum. The moral decay of the Friday the 13th deception was total. The king had lied to his people, the Pope had lied to his God, and the knights had been silenced for knowing too much. The concept of heaven was protected, but at the cost of the soul of the 14th century. The trials were not about justice. They were about the maintenance of a collective illusion. The church had to prove that the knights were demons so that the people wouldn't realize they were prophets of the empty. The inquisitors refined their techniques, creating a blueprint for state-sponsored terror that would be used for centuries to come, but the nothing cannot be chained. Even as the knights were led to the dungeons, the secret was being whispered in the taverns and the marketplaces. People began to hear of the second gospel. They began to wonder if the world was truly as the church described it. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it would eventually grow into the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, movements that would ultimately dismantle the church's monopoly on the truth. The Templars had lost the battle, but they had won the war of the mind. By being betrayed, they became the ultimate symbol of forbidden knowledge. Their absence became more powerful than their presence ever was. As we sit in the quiet of this chamber, we must ask ourselves, what was the true cost of that Friday morning? Was the preservation of heaven worth the blood of the men who had seen the void? Or are we still living in the shadow of that deception, praying to a sky that the Templars knew was empty? The candle is flickering now, the light struggling against the encroaching dark. The history books tell one story, but the stone walls of the old commanderies tell another. They speak of a night when the world changed, not because of a war, but because of a realization. The king thought he had buried the truth. The Pope thought he had erased the secret, but the void does not forget. It waits in the margins of the maps, in the silence, between the words of the prayers, and in the deep, unblinking eyes of the statues that still stand guard over the ruins of the order. The fire is low, and the shadows are long. But the story of the deception is only the beginning. The knights were in chains, but their work was not finished. They had one final, terrifying message to deliver to the world. A message that would be spoken not in words, but in fire and a curse that would echo through the bloodlines of the powerful dot in our next chapter. We will step inside the secret rituals of the Baphomet. The entity the Templars were accused of worshipping? We will discover that it was not a demon, but a biological map. A third testament etched into the mind that allowed the Knights to communicate with the very void that the Church so desperately feared. The real horror was not what the Templars did, but what they were becoming. The image of the goat-headed demon was the greatest smokescreen in human history. The Church did not fear that the Templars worshipped a devil. They feared that the Templars worshipped nothing at all. The name Baphomet was a linguistic lock, a forbidden secret designed to keep the world looking at a monster while the Knights looked into the abyss. It was a lie so elaborate that it cursed the Order for eternity, ensuring their true discovery remained buried under the weight of superstition and fear. The accusations of demonic pacts were a strategic betrayal, a way to explain the Knights' cold indifference to the cross without revealing the terrifying truth they held in their hands. They were not servants of darkness. They were explorers of a silence that preceded the light, and the Church would rather you believe in a demon than realize the throne of heaven is empty. The Baphomet was never a god. It was a mask for the void, a biological map to a place where the soul is unmade. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside has faded into a gray memory, and here, in the glow of a dying candle, we begin to peel back the layers of the grandest deception ever whispered in the halls of power. In the damp, lightless cells of the 13th century, the inquisitors were confused. They had been told to find evidence of the devil, but the men they were questioning didn't look like devil worshippers. They looked like mathematicians. They looked like philosophers who had reached the end of the world and found only a blank wall. To an American or Tier 1 audience, think of a cover-up so massive that it creates a fake religion just to hide a scientific anomaly. That was the Baphomet, when the trial records speak of a severed head, or a golden idol with 3 faces. They are describing a distorted version of a psychic tool. The Knights had found that the human brain, when subjected to specific geometric patterns and absolute silence, could perceive the nothing they had discovered in Jerusalem. They called this state the Baphomet. It was not a being to be worshipped, but a frequency to be achieved. Imagine a room in a Templar commandery. There is no altar. There are no black candles. There is only a single polished silver disc etched with lines that seem to shift if you look at them too long. The knight would sit before this disc for hours, his breathing slowing until his heart barely moved. He was wearing the Baphomet mask, not a physical mask of leather or wood, but a mental shroud that blocked out the physical world. The Church's inquisitors couldn't understand this. They needed a monster. They needed a demon because a demon fits into their story of good versus evil. Emptiness, however, does not. If there is a devil, the Church is still necessary to fight him. But if there is only a void, the Church is a redundant theater. The moral decay of the 1300s was born from this realization. The king and the pope knew that the nothing was more contagious than any heresy. They took the descriptions of the Knights' meditative tools and twisted them into the grotesque image of a goat-headed beast. They turned a map of the mind into a monster of the night. As you lie there in the quiet, imagine the sheer weight of that lie. For 700 years, the name Baphomet has been synonymous with evil. But in the secret archives, the word has a different origin. It is a coded cipher, a mathematical formula for the dissolution of the ego. The knights were not trying to summon a demon. They were trying to dissolve themselves into the silence. They were trying to return the accident of their existence to the great absence. This is why the Templars did not beg for mercy. They were already wearing the mask. They were already half gone, their minds anchored in the obsidian chamber while their bodies remained in the king's chains. The secret of the Baphomet was more than just a meditation. It was a biological discovery. The Templars had realized that the human form was not a temple of the soul, but a prison for the divine spark. They believed that by focusing on specific symbols, they could short-circuit the senses and see the world as it truly was, a fragile illusion held together by the collective belief of humanity. Think about the silence of a heavy snowfall. The way the sound is swallowed and the world feels closer, more intimate, yet strangely distant. This was the atmosphere the Templars sought. They were the masters of the interior architecture. They built their circular chapels to resonate with the sound of the void. If you were to walk into one of these chapels today, even in their ruined state, you would feel a strange pressure behind your eyes. That is the lingering echo of the Baphomet frequency. The informative history of the order shows that they were obsessed with mathematics. They were the ones who brought the concept of zero from the East into the heart of Europe. To the medieval mind, zero was a terrifying concept. It was the mathematical representation of nothing. The Church viewed it with suspicion, but the Templars viewed it as the ultimate truth. The Baphomet was the zero of the spirit. During the interrogations, a knight named Jean de Bourgogne was asked why he kissed the navel of the idol. His answer was recorded, but the meaning was lost on his torturers. He said he was looking for the center of the circle that has no circumference. He wasn't talking about a physical body. He was talking about a mathematical point of entry into the non-physical world. This is where the moral decay becomes a deep psychological thread. When a man decides that the physical world is a lie, his morals begin to shift. He no longer fears the laws of man because he sees the men who made them as flickering shadows. The Templars' legendary coldness, their ability to navigate the highest halls of power while remaining completely detached, was the result of this training. They were wearing the mask of Baphomet every day. They were the men who were not there. As the king's men searched the commanderies, they found strange things. They found boxes of magnetized iron. They found lenses made of polished quartz that didn't zoom in, but distorted light into patterns that looked like the surface of a deep, dark lake. They found no devilish grimoires, but they found thousands of pages of calculations regarding the movement of the stars and the spaces between the stars. The Church had to burn these pages. They had to transform these scientific and philosophical inquiries into sorcery. If the public knew that the knights were studying the nature of reality itself, they might start to ask their own questions. And a questioning public is a public that no longer pays for indulgences. So the lie was fed. The inquisitors told stories of the kiss of shame and the denial of the sun. They took the night's search for the inner sun, the light of the void, and claimed it was a worship of darkness. But as you listen to my voice, feel the stillness around you. Is the dark truly evil, or is it simply the space where the light has yet to arrive? The Templars chose the dark. They chose the quiet. They chose the mask because it allowed them to see what the rest of the world was too afraid to acknowledge. They were the first to understand that the nothing is not the absence of anything. It is the presence of everything that has not been forced into being. The Baphomet mask was a shield. It protected the knights from the crushing weight of their own realization. It allowed them to stand at the edge of the abyss and not blink. But as the trials reached their peak, the shield began to crack. The secret was becoming too powerful for even the 9 inner circles to contain. The nothing was starting to leak out. By the year 1312, the atmosphere in Paris was one of stifling dread. The trials had been going on for years, and the city felt as if it were under a permanent cloud. People reported that the bread tasted like ash. They said the water in the Seine had turned as black as ink. The Templars were in their cells, but their influence was felt everywhere. The inquisitors who had handled the idols were beginning to lose their minds. They spoke of a face with 3 eyes that watched them from the shadows of their own bedrooms. They were seeing the Baphomet mask in their own reflections. The nothing was no longer a secret. It was a contagion. The king realized that he could not just kill the knights. He had to kill the idea. He ordered all the idols to be melted down or crushed into dust. But you cannot crush a frequency. You cannot burn a realization. The more he tried to destroy the physical evidence, the more the psychological reality of the void spread through the nobility and the clergy. The moral decay had reached the very top. The Pope was no longer sure if he was serving God or merely guarding a tomb. He looked at the Baphomet. Accusations he had signed and saw them for the pathetic lies they were. He was a man who had sold his soul to protect a heaven he no longer believed in. And the knights, they sat in the dark and waited. They knew that the mask was about to be removed. Not by the king, but by time itself. They had done the calculations. They knew that the nothing they had found beneath the temple was not a local phenomenon. It was a cosmic one. It was the end state of all things. As we drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the possibility that the Templars were right. That the world we see, the people we love, the wars we fight are all just a thin veil over a deep, silent, and perfect void. The Baphomet was the only thing that allowed them to look at that truth and not go mad. But what happens when the mask is taken away? What happens when the elite warriors, the masters of the void, are brought out into the light of the fire? The Grandmaster Jacques de Molay was preparing for his final performance. He knew that the fire would not just consume his flesh. It would act as a beacon. It would draw the nothing into the physical world in a way that could never be undone. The king thought he was ending a heresy, but he was actually finishing a ritual that the 9 knights had started 200 years before. He was opening the door that the Templars had spent their lives trying to unlock. The mask of Baphomet was about to fall, and behind it was a truth that would haunt the bloodlines of kings and popes for centuries to come. A truth that began with a scream in the dark and ended with a silence that could be felt in every corner of the world. The candle is almost gone. The parchment is cold. But the secret of the Baphomet is not finished with us. The mask has been lifted, but the face beneath is not what you expect. It is not a monster. It is a mirror. In our next chapter, we will follow the Templars as they move beyond the mask and into the alchemical collapse. We will see what happens when the most powerful men in the world lose their fear of death and begin to experiment with the literal dissolution of their own souls. The vaults of the Templars are opening, and what is coming out is not gold, but a transformation that will make the very stones of the cathedral scream in terror. Imagine standing in a roaring fire and feeling only a sense of profound relief. This was the terrifying reality of the Knights Templar in their final days. The world calls it courage, but the truth is far more disturbing. They had simply lost the capacity for fear. In the hidden scriptory of their commanderies, the elite warriors of Christ discovered a secret that shattered the very foundation of the medieval mind. They found that the other side was not a kingdom of gold or a pit of fire, but a vast, silent ocean of nothingness that made the pain of the flesh seem like a flickering shadow. The Church had spent centuries using the fear of hell to control the souls of men, but you cannot control a man who has seen the void and found it beautiful. This was the alchemical collapse, a moral and spiritual decay where faith was replaced by a cold mathematical certainty. The Templars didn't just stop believing in the Pope, they stopped believing in the reality of death itself. They realized that the soul was not a gift to be saved, but a burden to be dissolved. This is the forbidden knowledge that turned their devotion into a curse and their prayers into a ritual of erasure. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn against the world, and the only sound is the rhythmic heartbeat of a dying fire. Let your mind drift back to the late 13th century, to the stone laboratories of the order where the air was thick with the scent of mercury and the weight of a silence that could crush the soul. In the final decades before their arrest, the Templars became obsessed with a different kind of warfare. They were no longer interested in the shifting borders of the Holy Land. They were interested in the borders of existence. To a modern audience, alchemy is often seen as a foolish quest to turn lead into gold. But for the inner circle of the temple, gold was a triviality. They already possessed the wealth of kingdoms. Their alchemy was biological and psychological. They were seeking to turn the human spirit into the void. They called this the great work of dissolution. In the cold, vaulted cellars of places like Castle Pilgrim and the Paris Temple, the knights began to experiment with the very substances of the earth. They worked with mercury, sulfur, and salt, but not as chemists. They viewed these elements as physical representations of the accident of creation. If the world was a prison, then chemistry was the study of the bars. Imagine a knight, a man who had survived a dozen battles, sitting in a dark room illuminated only by the blue flame of an alchemical furnace. He is not praying to the Virgin Mary, he is watching a glass vial. He is watching the way matter breaks down, how it loses its form and becomes a gas, a vapor, a nothingness. He is training his mind to see his own body in the same way. The psychological layer of this collapse was profound. In the medieval world, faith was the anchor of everything. People lived their lives according to the rhythm of the church bells. But as the Templars moved deeper into their studies, the bells began to sound like hollow iron. They realized that if the other side was truly the silence described in the second gospel, then the concept of faith was a misunderstanding. You do not need faith to face a void. You only need the will to vanish. This realization led to a terrifying loss of empathy. If the people around them were just flickering accidents of matter, then their suffering was irrelevant. The Templars began to treat the world with a detachment that felt like a cold wind. They would walk through the crowded markets of Paris, seeing not people, but temporary arrangements of dust. This was the moral decay that the king's spies finally noticed. It wasn't that the knights were doing evil. It was that they were no longer doing anything human. They were becoming alchemically stable. In their philosophy, to be stable was to be empty. They were seeking a state of mind where neither pain nor pleasure could leave a mark. They were practiced in the art of the static soul. This is why, when the inquisitors eventually applied the rack and the thumbscrews, The knights didn't scream for mercy. They looked at their own broken limbs with the curiosity of a man watching a dry leaf crumble in the wind. They had already disconnected the I from the flesh. As the alchemical collapse deepened, the Templars began to record their findings in a code that even the most learned scholars of the Vatican could not break. They spoke of the black sun and the hidden nitrogen. These were metaphors for the state of the soul after it had been stripped of its earthly attachments. To the American listener seeking information, this is the missing link between medieval mysticism and modern psychological dissociation. The Templars were pioneers of the end of the self. The atmospheric build of their commanderies changed during this time. The walls were often painted with dark, matte pigments that swallowed the light. They wanted to live in a space that mimicked the void. In these shadows, they practiced the ritual of the last breath. A knight would be placed in a stone sarcophagus while still alive. He would stay there for days in total darkness and total silence, until his mind began to generate its own light, a cold, silvery radiance that they believed was the true form of the spirit. When these knights emerged from the sarcophagus, they were changed. Their eyes were often dilated, their skin pale as bone. They would speak of the other side not as a place of judgment, but as a place of infinite space. They claimed that the God of the Church was a small, angry child compared to the vast, silent majesty of the absence. This was the point where faith became fear. Not fear for the knights, but fear for everyone who encountered them. The common soldiers of the order began to feel a creeping dread in the presence of their masters. They saw men who had stopped eating, men who sat in the sun for hours without blinking, men who seemed to have no shadows. The rumor spread that the Templars had sold their shadows to the East, but the truth was that they were simply becoming transparent to the world. The moral decay of the order was now a biological reality. They were no longer capable of the sins the Church understood. They didn't lust for women or wealth. They lusted for the end of the world. They wanted to trigger a collective collapse, an alchemical reaction that would dissolve the prison of the physical world and return everything to the silence of the beginning. They believed that the wealth they had gathered was the catalyst. Gold, they discovered, had a specific resonance. If you gathered enough of it in one place and subjected it to the right frequency, it would create a hole in reality. This is why they were so protective of their treasuries. It wasn't about greed. It was about the weight of the metal. They were building a gravity anchor for the void. King Philip the Fair, in his narrow-minded pursuit of gold, inadvertently saved the world from this experiment. By arresting the knights and seizing the metal, he broke the concentration of the catalyst, but he did not understand the danger of what he was touching. When his men broke into the secret laboratories, they found jars of substances that defied the laws of nature. They found liquids that flowed upward and powders that turned the air into ice. The king's men were terrified. They saw these things as witchcraft, but they were witnessing the first tremors of a reality that was being unmade. The alchemical collapse was not just a metaphor. It was a physical threat to the existence of France. Inside the prisons, the knights continued their work. They realized that they didn't need the laboratories or the gold. They had their own bodies. They turned the torture chambers into their final oratories. Every strike of the whip was used as a rhythmic cue to deepen their trance. They were proving that the other side was accessible even through the gate of agony. They were laughing at the inquisitors, not with sound, but with their presence. The men who were supposed to be the defenders of the faith had become the explorers of the end. They had found a way to make death redundant. And in doing so, they had committed the ultimate betrayal of the Church. The Church's power relies on the transition from this life to the next being a moment of profound importance. The Templars had turned it into a simple door. The collapse was total. By the time the final fires were lit in 1314, the Templars were no longer men in any sense that the king or the pope understood. They were vessels for the void. As Jacques de Molay stood upon the pyre, the crowd expected a confession or a plea for divine mercy. They expected a man terrified of the flames, but de Molay stood with the stillness of a mountain. He looked at the flames as if they were nothing more than a curtain of light. He knew that the fire was not an end, but a final alchemical step. It was the calcination, the burning away of the last impurities of the flesh to release the nothing within. The fear that gripped the spectators that day was not because of the cruelty of the execution. It was because they realized in a primal way that the man in the fire was happy. He was finally going to the place he had spent his life studying. He was entering the great absence, and he was taking the secret with him. The alchemical ups had succeeded. The Templars had destroyed the power of death over their own minds. But in doing so, they left a world that was now haunted by the possibility that their discovery was true. If the other side is empty, then what are we doing here? What is the purpose of the cathedrals, the kings, and the wars? The moral decay they left behind was like a slow-acting poison in the veins of Europe. The people began to look at the sky with a new kind of dread. They wondered if the silence they heard at night was just the wind, or if it was the sound of the void that the Templars had invited into the world. The secret of the alchemical collapse is that it never truly ended. The knights were burned, their gold was scattered, and their names were erased. But the discovery of the nothing remained in the margins of the surviving manuscripts. It waited in the quiet corners of the mind, a forbidden knowledge that whispers that the end is not something to be feared, but something to be achieved. As we lie here in the growing dark, we must wonder, what did they see in those final moments? When the flesh fell away and the light of the fire became the light of the void, did they find the peace they were looking for? Or did they find that the absence was even larger than they had imagined? The candle is flickering its final rhythm. The warmth of the fire is fading into the cool night air. The history of the Templars is a history of a world that tried to burn a secret, only to find that the secret was the fire itself. They had turned their faith into fear, and their fear into a cold, perfect silence. The lab is dark now. The mercury has stopped flowing. The great work is finished. But the silence that the knights brought back from the east is still here. It is in the room with you now. It is the space between your breaths. It is the void that waits when the story ends. In our next chapter, we will step away from the fire and into the shadow in the commandery. We will discover how the secret survived the executioners and how the living without a soul became a reality for the survivors, who fled to the edges of the world. The Templars were gone, but their shadows were still walking the halls of power, and they were no longer alone. Something else was walking with them. The most terrifying thing about the Knights Templar was not their swords. It was their eyes. By the late 13th century, the men returning from the East were no longer human in any way the world could understand. They had seen the void, and it had consumed the very essence of their souls. In the remote commanderies across Europe, a new and forbidden way of life took root, a silent existence where the breath of the living was replaced by the cold static of the abyss. They did not eat, they did not sleep, and they certainly did not pray. They had discovered that the soul was merely a barrier to true power, a cage that had to be broken to reach the silence. The people of the surrounding villages whispered of men who walked without shadows and stood in the rain for hours without blinking. This was a profound moral decay, a betrayal of the human condition itself. The knights had become walking ghosts, architects of an emptiness that threatened to swallow the light of the world. They were living proof that once you have looked into the second gospel, you can never truly be alive again. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside the stone walls has ceased to exist, and we are left only with the rhythmic flickering of a single candle. Let your mind drift back to a winter night in a Templar commandery, where the air is cold and the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight. Against your skin, imagine a fortress of gray stone, isolated on a windswept plateau in the south of France. To the traveler it looks like any other military outpost. But once you pass through the heavy oak gates, the atmosphere shifts. There's no sound of laughter, no clatter of plates, and no barking of dogs. The horses in the stables are unnervingly still, their breath fogging in the cold air as they stand in a trance-like state inside the great hall. The knights sit at a long wooden table. This is the ritual of the silent dinner. There is no food on the table, only empty bowls and a single unlit lamp in the center. The knights sit in full armor, their white mantles draped over their shoulders like shrouds. They do not look at one another. They do not speak. They sit for hours in total darkness, staring at a single point on the wall. This was the shadow life. For an American or Tier 1 audience, this is the ultimate exploration of psychological dissociation. The Templars were practicing a form of existence that completely bypassed the senses. They had realized that the void they found beneath the temple was not just a place but a state of mind. By removing every human distraction, they were attempting to anchor that void into the physical stone of their fortresses. The servants who worked in these commanderies lived in a state of constant, low-level terror. They reported that the knights would often forget to move for days at a time. A knight might be standing in the scriptorium, reaching for a book, and simply stop, his hand frozen in the air for 12 hours while his mind traveled through the absence. They were becoming like the statues they commissioned, stone on the outside and hollow on the inside. This was the moral decay that the church found so offensive. In the medieval mind, the soul was the seat of all virtue. To intentionally discard the soul was to become a monster, but the Templars didn't see it that way. They saw the soul as a source of weakness, a collection of fears and desires that kept a man tethered to a dying world. By living without a soul, they believed they were becoming indestructible. The interaction with the outside world became a mechanical performance. When a knight had to speak to a merchant or a local lord, his voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. It sounded like a recording, a series of sounds produced by a body that was no longer inhabited. They would look through the person they were talking to, their pupils wide and unreactive to the light. This gave rise to the legend of the Templar stare, a gaze so empty it could cause a man to lose his own sense of self. The commanderies themselves were redesigned to support this state of soulless existence. The Templars were master builders, but they were no longer building for the comfort of men. They began to use a specific type of acoustic engineering. The halls were designed to swallow sound, not reflect it. If you dropped a coin on the stone floor, the sound would not echo. It would simply die, as if the air itself was made of velvet. They also experimented with the play of light. They'd placed narrow windows at precise angles so that the sun would only enter the room in thin, razor-sharp beams. These beams did not illuminate the room. They only served to highlight the thickness of the darkness around them. The knights would stand in these beams, allowing the light to hit their eyes while their bodies remained in the shadow. They were training themselves to be the interface between the light of the sun and the cold of the void in the late hours of the night. The commandery became a laboratory of the spirit. The knights who had seen the void would gather in the circular chapel. They would stand in a ring, their hands not touching, but held a few inches apart. They were creating a circuit of absence. They would hum a single note, a low frequency that resonated with the base of the skull. This was not a hymn. It was a physical tool to further dissolve the connection between their consciousness and their bodies to the informative mind. This sounds like early experiments in sensory deprivation and resonance. The Templars were using the physical laws of the universe to try and bypass the biological limits of the brain. They were searching for the 0 point of the human experience. They believed that if they could reach absolute zero, they would be able to slip through the cracks of reality and enter the great silence. The psychological toll on the few uninitiated brothers left in the order was immense. These younger men who had joined for the glory of the Crusades found themselves living in a house of shadows. They saw their masters becoming transparent, their skin turning a translucent, waxy color. They saw that the Grand Masters no longer bled when they were cut. Instead, a thin, clear fluid would seep from the wound. Smelling of ozone and old salt, the moral decay extended to their view of human life. Because they no longer valued their own souls, they saw no value in the souls of others. They began to view humanity as a crop to be harvested or a resource to be used. This is why the Templar banking system became so ruthless. They weren't interested in wealth for its own sake. They were using the movement of gold as a way to track the energy of the physical world. They were like scientists observing an ant colony, cold and detached from the struggles of the individual, one survivor of the order, a knight who fled before the arrests, described the atmosphere of the Paris Temple as a place where the air had been replaced by a slow poison. He said that the longer you stayed there, the more you forgot the names of your parents, the taste of wine, and the feeling of warmth. You became a shadow in the commandery, a piece of the architecture that just happened to walk. This was the secret life of the elite warriors. They had conquered the Holy Land, but in doing so, they had been conquered by the silence that lay beneath it. They were the most powerful men in the world, and yet they owned nothing, not even their own identities. They were the first men in history to realize that power is not found in what you have, but in what you are willing to let go. As the 14th century dawned, the boundary between the commanderies and the void was becoming dangerously thin. The knights were no longer just living without souls. They were starting to manifest the properties of the void in the world around them. Objects in the commanderies would lose their weight. Fires would burn without heat. The shadows on the walls would move even when the knights stood still. The moral decay had reached its final stage. The Templars had become a threat to the stability of physical reality itself. This is the true reason for the king's panic. Philip the Fair was not just worried about his debts. He was worried that the very ground beneath his feet was being unmade by the presence of these hollow men. He saw the shadow in the commandery and realized that if he did not act, The shadow would eventually cover all of France. The arrest orders were not just a legal maneuver. They were a desperate attempt to break the resonance. By scattering the knights and placing them in separate dungeons, the king hoped to shatter the collective void they had created. But you cannot kill a shadow by cutting it with a sword. The knights in the dungeons continued their practice. Even in chains, they sat in the silent dinner. They stared at the damp walls of their cells and saw the obsidian chamber. They were no longer afraid of the fire because the fire could not burn what was already gone. They were hollow men, and the void was their only master. As we sink deeper into the quiet of the night, consider the silence that is around you now. Is it a peaceful silence, or is it the same heavy, cold silence that filled the Templar commanderies? Are you truly alone in the room, or is there a shadow that has no source? The Templars were the first to walk this path, but they were not the last. Their legacy is not in the gold they left behind, but in the silence they brought into the world. A silence that whispers that the soul is just a story we tell ourselves to stay warm in the dark. And as the candle of our story flickers its last breath, the darkness feels a little closer, a little more familiar. The gates of the commandery are closed. The nights are still. The void is waiting. But even as the shadows grow long, the story is not over. The knights are in their cells, but the nothing they created is about to be put on trial. And what the Inquisitors are about to hear will change the history of the world forever. In our next chapter, we will step into the courtroom of the Vatican. We will hear the secret trial transcripts that the Church has kept hidden for 700 years. We will discover the unspoken charges, the terrifying things the Templars actually confessed to when they were no longer wearing their masks. The void is about to speak, and its words will burn colder than any flame. In the deepest vaults of the Vatican secret archives, there is a collection of scrolls that do not officially exist. They are the forbidden transcripts of the year 1308. The records of a trial where the judge was as terrified as the accused. Pope Clement V did not merely condemn the Knights Templar for heresy. He was forced to witness a betrayal of reality that nearly destroyed his own mind. When the Grand Masters were brought before him in the private chambers of the Pote, they did not beg for mercy. They spoke of a secret so profound and a lie so ancient that the Pope refused to even name the charges in the public record. The official accusations of idol worship and spitting on the cross were a strategic distraction, a thin veil to hide the moral decay that had reached the very heart of the papacy. The knights had found the edge of the world, and they had found that there was nothing on the other side. This is the truth the king buried, a curse written in black ink on parchment that still feels cold to the touch. The Vatican didn't burn the Templars to save their souls. They burned them to stop the silence from speaking. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The modern world is a distant dream, and we are standing in the flickering candlelight of a fortress where the walls are sweating with the secrets of the dead. Let your mind drift into the stillness of the 14th century, where every scratching pen is a heartbeat of history. The trial of the Knights Templar is often remembered as a grand spectacle of the Inquisition, but the most important moments happened in total silence. In the late summer of 1308, Pope Clement V moved the proceedings to the city of Poitiers. He was a man plagued by illness, his body failing him even as he held the highest office in the world. He sat upon a throne of carved oak, wrapped in furs despite the heat, and watched as the elite warriors of the cross were led in one by one. They did not look like broken men. Despite the months in the king's dungeons, the high-ranking knights carried themselves with a terrifying hollow dignity. They were the men who had seen the void, and their presence in the room made the candles flicker as if a cold wind had followed them in. The Pope's scribes sat ready with their quills, their faces pale in the dim light. But as the testimonies began, the scratching of the pens frequently stopped. The scribes would look at the Pope, their eyes wide with a question they dared not ask. The Pope would simply shake his head, a silent command to leave those words out of the record. This is why the official China and parchment and other public documents seem so repetitive and bizarre. They focus on the Baphomet and the petty rituals of initiation. But the secret transcripts, the ones kept in the lead-lined chests of the inner sanctum, tell a story of a psychological collapse that threatened the very concept of the divine. Imagine the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, standing before the head of the church. He didn't speak of demons or gold. He spoke of the absence of the echo. He told the Pope that during their 7 years of digging beneath the Temple of Solomon, they had reached a point where prayer no longer functioned. He described a geographical location where the human voice would travel out and never return, as if the sky above Jerusalem was a door that had been locked from the other side. To a Tier 1 audience, this is the ultimate existential horror. The Templars weren't just losing their faith. They were performing a technical audit of the universe and finding that the celestial ledger was empty. They told the Pope that the moral decay he suspected in their order was actually a reflection of the decay of the cosmos. Clement V listened to these words and felt the foundations of his world shaking. He realized that he couldn't charge them with apostasy because that would imply their discovery was a matter of belief. If he admitted that they had found a physical void, he would be admitting that the church was a fortress built over a pit of nothingness. So, he chose to censor the truth. He ordered the unspoken charges. These were the parts of the testimony that described the second Messiah, the one who was born in the shadows and whose mission was to unmake the world. The knights confessed that they were no longer defending the Holy Land, but were guarding the wound in the earth to ensure that the silence didn't spread too quickly. The atmospheric build of these secret trial sessions was one of stifling, airless dread. The Pope would often have to stop the proceedings because he was gasping for air. He felt as if the knight's words were literally removing the oxygen from the room. He began to see the knights not as criminals, but as carriers of a psychic plague. Every time they spoke of the void, a piece of his own faith died. The moral decay began to infect the inquisitors themselves. Several of the younger priests who were assigned to record the testimonies reportedly went mad within weeks. They began to hear the absence in their own prayers. They would stand in the cathedral and look up at the crucifix, and instead of seeing a savior, they would see a hollow wooden shape. They were catching the Templar stare, that wide-eyed, unblinking gaze that looked through the world of matter and into the deep dark. The Pope realized that the trial was a trap. The more he questioned the knights, the more he was being drawn into their reality. He decided that the transcripts must be divided. The public would hear of the idols and the denial of Christ. These were sins the public could understand and hate. But the unspoken charges, the descriptions of the mathematical void and the uncreation would be buried so deep that even the memory of them would fade. This is the psychological bridge between the medieval and the modern world. The church was acting as a censor of reality itself. They were trying to preserve the concept of heaven by any means necessary. As you lie there in the quiet Imagine the scratching of those pens in the dark. Imagine the scribe's hand trembling as he writes a sentence he knows he must never repeat. The knights described the alchemical collapse of their own spirits. They explain that once you have seen the nothing, you can no longer interact with humanity as a person. You become a shadow, a functional mechanism that carries the secret. They told the Pope that the moral decay of their banking system, their coldness and their secrecy were all necessary biological protections. They had to stay separate from the believers because the weight of their knowledge would crush a normal soul. They were the keepers of the absence, the voluntary prisoners of a truth that the world was not ready to hear. The Pope asked them if there was any hope. If there was a way to close the wound they had found. The knights remained silent for a long time. Then Hugo de Parod, one of the highest-ranking officers, whispered a single phrase that was supposedly erased from every document except for a private letter the Pope sent to his successor. He said, "The silence is not a wound, it is the destination." This was the ultimate betrayal. The knights were essentially saying that the end of the world was not a catastrophe to be avoided, but a natural state that they were simply accelerating. The Church's entire mission is based on the idea of a destination called paradise. The Templars were offering a destination called nothing. The Vatican's secret trial was not a search for justice, but a desperate act of damage control. The Pope was trying to calculate how many people had been exposed to the second gospel. He realized that the order's network was so vast that the secret might already be hidden in the architecture of every cathedral in Europe. He began to see the symbols of the void everywhere. In the rose windows, in the groin vaults, in the way the stone was carved to create specific shadows. He was becoming a prisoner of the Templars' perspective. He looked at the golden vessels on his altar and saw only the labor of men trying to distract themselves from the dark. He looked at the holy relics and saw only old bones. The moral decay had reached the throne of St. Peter, and the Pope realized that the only way to save himself was to destroy the messengers, but he couldn't just execute them. He had to erase them. He ordered that the trials be conducted in total secrecy from that point on. No more scribes. No more witnesses. Only the Pope, the Grand Masters. And the silence, the documents from these private sessions are the ones that are truly unspoken. They contain the diagrams of the non-Euclidean soul. They describe how the Templars had learned to unexist in certain spaces, allowing them to move through walls or be in two places at once. These were not miracles, but the result of their understanding that physical laws are just suggestions made by a creator who had long since left the building. The Pope was horrified to find that he was starting to believe them. He felt the weight of his own robes becoming lighter. He felt the stone floor beneath his feet becoming soft and translucent. He was losing his grip on the lies of the world. He realized that if he didn't stop, he would become a shadow himself. He ended the trial abruptly. He declared that the Templars were guilty of all charges, even the ones he knew were fabricated. He needed to close the book. He needed to put a wall of fire between the church and the void. But as he signed the death warrants, the Pope felt a cold sensation in his heart that would never leave him. He knew that the trial hadn't ended anything. He had merely buried the absence in the basement of history, where it would continue to grow, silent and unobserved. Until the end of time, the trial was over, but the air in the Vatican remained heavy. The Pope's health collapsed completely in the months that followed. He was haunted by the faces of the knights, their wide, empty eyes watching him from the corners of his room. He spent his final days in a state of constant prayer, but his confessors noted that he never looked up. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, as if he were afraid that if he looked at the sky, he would see the void looking back, the secret trial transcripts, or locked in a leaden box and hidden in a wall that was then bricked over. The unspoken charges became a myth, a ghost story whispered by librarians in the dark. But the moral decay they represented couldn't be bricked over. The realization that the other side was empty had been spoken into the atmosphere of the world, and it was now a permanent part of the human psyche. To the American or Tier 1 listener, this is the origin of the deep state of the medieval mind. It is the beginning of the era of high-level censorship and the manipulation of reality for the sake of social stability. The Church realized that the truth is often the most dangerous weapon of all, and that the only way to govern a people is to keep them from looking into the abyss. As we lie here in the growing dark, we must ask ourselves what else is hidden in those secret archives. What other unspoken charges have been brought against those who found the truth? The Templars were burned, but the silence they discovered is still here. It is the space between the words of our history books. It is the cold air that rushes out when an old door is opened. The knights were living without a soul because they had found something larger and more terrifying to inhabit. They were the first to move into the absence, and they are waiting for us to join them. The Pope's fire did not consume the secret. It only gave it a voice of smoke and ash. The candle is flickering its final rhythm. The warmth of the room is being replaced by the cool, steady pressure of the night. The trial is finished. The judge is dead. The accused are gone. But the unspoken remains. It is the quiet that settles over you when you finally stop trying to find a meaning in the dark. The pens have stopped scratching. The scrolls are sealed. The void is still. But as the shadows settle over the stone, we realize that the silence of the Vatican was not a victory. It was a surrender. A surrender to the fact that the truth is a fire that cannot be contained by any cage, whether it is made of iron or of faith. In our next chapter, we will step out of the courtroom and into the architecture of absence. We will look at the symbols left in stone, the hidden maps the Templars carved into the very walls of their cathedrals to ensure that their secret would survive the flames. The Church tried to erase their words, but they forgot that the stones themselves have memory. And the stones are finally beginning to speak. The towering spires of the Gothic cathedrals were never intended to reach toward heaven. They were designed to act as anchors for a silence that predates the stars. For centuries, the world has believed that the Knights Templar funded these magnificent stone giants to honor the divine. But the blueprints tell a different story, a story of betrayal and forbidden geometry. Every arch, every vaulted ceiling, and every cryptic carving was a coordinate in a map to the non-place, the terrifying void the knights discovered beneath the Temple of Solomon. The Church provided the gold and the land, unaware that they were commissioning the construction of portals to an absence that would eventually consume the concept of the soul. This was a profound moral decay hidden in plain sight, a secret etched into the very stones that people knelt upon in prayer. The cathedrals were not houses of God. They were laboratories of the void, designed to vibrate at a frequency that unmakes the human spirit. The light that pours through the stained glass is a distraction, a beautiful lie meant to hide the darkness that the architecture is truly built to contain. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The modern world is a fading echo, and we are standing in the long, cool shadow of a stone pillar that has watched the world change for 700 years. Let your mind drift into the stillness of the 13th century, where the sound of the chisel against rock is the only heartbeat of a secret history. In the heart of the medieval world, a revolution in stone was taking place. Before the Templars returned from the East, churches were heavy, dark, and thick-walled, built like fortresses to keep the world out. But suddenly, with a surge of Templar wealth and influence, the architecture of Europe began to reach upward. Walls became thin, light became abundant, and the stone seemed to defy the laws of gravity. To the uninitiated, this was the Gothic style, a celebration of divine light. But to the inner circle of the order, this was the architecture of absence. The Knights had brought back more than just a scroll from Jerusalem. They had brought back a new understanding of mathematics. They understood that space is not empty. They understood that geometry can be used to influence the human psyche in ways that the Church could not even imagine. When you walk into a Templar-influenced cathedral, such as Chartres or Notre Dame, your first instinct is to look up. This is not an accident of design. It is a calculated psychological cue to pull your attention away from the earth and toward a vanishing point that leads nowhere. The pillars of these great structures were often designed to be non-existent. They are so slender and so tall that they seem to disappear into the gloom of the vaulted ceiling. This creates a sense of weightlessness, a feeling that the physical world is losing its grip on you. The Templars were not trying to make you feel closer to God. They were trying to make you feel as if you were dissolving. They were using the stone to create a physical manifestation of the alchemical ups they had practiced. In their private rituals, the informative history of the period shows that the Templars were the primary patrons of the Children of Solomon, a guild of master masons who possessed secrets of stone cutting that were thousands of years old. These masons were not just builders. They were initiates in the order's negative theology. They understood that every stone they laid was a piece of a larger machine. A machine that was designed to resonate with the nothing that the Knights had found. Imagine a master mason standing in the center of a half-finished nave at midnight. He is not looking at the crucifix. He is looking at the way the shadows fall between the unfinished ribs of the vault. He is checking the angles to ensure that when the sun reaches a certain point in the sky, the light will hit the floor in a way that marks a specific coordinate in the void. Every carving of a gargoyle or a saint was a marker, a symbol that only those who had read the second gospel would understand. The moral decay of this process was total. The Church was paying for its own erasure. Every tithe collected from a starving peasant was being used to build a structure that would eventually tell that peasant that his soul did not exist. The Templars were the ultimate double agents of reality, using the symbols of faith to map the territory of the abyss. The most significant symbol in the architecture of the Templars was the octagon. You see it in the floor plans of their private chapels and in the base of the great spires. To the medieval mind, the number 8 represented the new beginning, the day after the creation of the world. But for the Knights, the octagon was a geometric lock. It was the shape that sat between the square of the earth and the circle of the infinite. It was the transition point where the world of matter became the world of absence. When a knight stood in the center of an octagonal chapel, he was standing in the non-place. The acoustics of the 8 walls created a unique resonance that could actually suppress the brain's ability to process external sound. It was a sensory deprivation chamber built of limestone and mortar. In the center of the floor, there was often a single, dark stone that did not match the rest. This was the 0 point, the place where the mapping of the void began. To an American or Tier 1 audience, this is the ultimate architectural mystery. Think of it as a series of physical hacks designed to alter human consciousness without the need for substances or words. The Templars were the first to realize that you could program a space to produce a specific emotional and spiritual response, the rose. Windows are another key element in this map of absence. While the Church claimed they represented the Virgin Mary or the Wheel of Fortune, the Templars saw them as the eye of the void. If you look closely at the geometry of a Templar-influenced rose window, you will notice that the petals of the rose do not lead to a center point. Instead, they lead to a central void, a circular opening of clear glass or empty space that represents the great absence. The light that passes through these windows is filtered through deep reds and blues, colors that were chosen for their specific psychological weight. Red represents the flesh of the world, and blue represents the spirit of the air. When these colors overlap on the stone floor of the cathedral, they create a purple shadow that the knights called the shadow of the unmaking. Imagine a novice knight being led into the cathedral at dawn. He is told to stand in that purple shadow and look directly into the central void of the rose window. As the light hits his eyes, the geometry of the window begins to spin in his vision. The complex patterns of the stone tracery act as a hypnotic trigger, breaking his connection to his own identity. He is being unmade by the building itself. The moral decay of the order was reflected in these windows. They were often paid for by the indulgences of the wealthy, money given to the church to buy a place in heaven. But the windows themselves were telling a different story, that heaven was a circle with no center, an infinite space that could not be bought or sold, because it contained nothing. The maps to the non-place were not just in the large-scale geometry. They were in the smallest details. In the carvings of the capitals, you often find green men, faces made of leaves that seem to be screaming. The church told the people these were symbols of nature and rebirth, but the Templars knew they represented the suffocation of the soul. The moment when the biological world consumes the divine spark. There are also the labyrinths, built into the floors of cathedrals like Chartres. Pilgrims would walk these paths on their knees, thinking they were on a symbolic journey to Jerusalem. But the Templars designed the labyrinths as mathematical models of the infinite loop, the trap of physical existence. The center of the labyrinth was not a prize. It was a realization that there is no way out of the prison of matter except through the dissolution of the self. The architects of the order were the silent scribes. They were writing the second gospel into the very foundations of Europe. They knew that even if their scrolls were burned and their leaders executed, the buildings would remain. The stone would keep the secret. The geometry would continue to resonate. Long after the name of the Templars had been cursed, a person could walk into a cathedral and, without knowing why, feel the cold pull of the void. This was the ultimate virile strategy of the medieval age. The Templars realized that you don't need to win an argument if you can build the room in which the argument takes place. They were shaping the reality of the future by carving the absence into the present. As the trials of the 1400s reached their end, the Inquisitors began to realize that the architecture of absence was a map they could not follow. They tried to find hidden rooms and secret compartments within the cathedrals, thinking the Templars had hidden their gold in the walls. They hammered at the stone and searched the crypts, but they found nothing. They didn't understand that the secret was not in the stone, but of the stone. The gold was gone, but the geometry remained. The Inquisitors felt the same Templar stare coming from the buildings themselves. They felt a sense of existential dread whenever they entered a Templar-built church, a feeling that they were being watched by an absence. The moral decay of the church was exposed by its inability to destroy the Templar legacy. They could kill the men, but they could not kill the spires. They were forced to continue using the cathedrals to conduct their masses and their prayers within structures that were designed to undermine them. Every time a priest spoke of heaven inside a Templar vault, the geometry of the room was whispering, "Nothing? This is the lingering curse of the Order. We are still surrounded by their maps to the non-place." When you stand in the center of a great European city and look up at the ancient stone towers, you are looking at the coordinates of a void that was discovered 900 years ago. The architecture is a silent witness to a truth that was too dangerous to speak. A truth that says the world we inhabit is a temporary structure, built over a permanent silence. As we lie here in the growing dark, consider the walls of your own room. Are they just wood and plaster, or are they also a part of a geometry that you don't yet understand? The Templars knew that every space is a map. They knew that the way we build our world is a reflection of the void we carry inside us. The candle is flickering its last rhythm. The warmth of the fire is fading into the cool night air. The architecture of absence is all around us, a silent map to a place that doesn't exist. The spires are reaching, but they are reaching for the dark. The windows are open, but they are looking at the void. The secret is etched in stone. The coordinate is set, and as you drift into the silence of sleep, you are beginning to follow the map. You are entering the non-place, the territory of the nothing that the Knights discovered so long ago. The cathedral is empty. The masons have laid down their tools. The geometry is still. But as the shadows lengthen across the stone floor, we realize that the map is not finished. The Templars left one final coordinate, a destination that wasn't built of stone but of fire. In our next chapter, we will leave the stone spires behind and step into the burning of the last Grand Master. We will witness the final alchemical step, the moment when the architecture of absence was ignited by the flames of execution. We will discover the true power of a curse spoken from the heart of the fire, a curse that would burn the very bloodlines of the kings who thought they had won. The map is leading us to the stake, and the final secret is about to be spoken in a language of smoke and light. On the 18th of March, 1314, the city of Paris witnessed an act of censorship that backfired into a cosmic curse. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, did not die for a treasure of gold or a piece of the true cross. He was burned to silence a truth that would have dismantled the very concept of the human soul. As the flames climbed the wooden pyre on the small island in the Seine, the witnesses didn't hear a man screaming in agony. They heard a voice that resonated with the cold frequency of the void. The Malay was not a victim. He was a final broadcast. He used his final breaths to speak a forbidden language. A series of sounds that acted as a biological trigger against the bloodlines of those who had betrayed the order. The king and the pope believed they were destroying a heresy. but they were actually providing the fuel for a ritual that would haunt Europe for centuries. The execution was the final alchemical step in the great work of dissolution, a moment where the nothing found its voice in the fire. This was the ultimate moral failure of the medieval world, a desperate attempt to burn a secret that was already etched into the fabric of reality. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside the window is a distant, flickering memory, and we are standing on the damp, mist-shrouded banks of the River Seine in the year 1314. Let your mind drift into the gray light of a Parisian dusk, where the smoke of the city mingles with the cold breath of the water. The day of the execution was unusually cold for March. A heavy, leaden sky hung over the Ile de la Cité, and the air felt thick with a static electricity that made the hair on the spectators' necks stand on end. For 7 years, Jacques de Molay had been kept in the darkness of the king's dungeons. He had been tortured, he had been starved, and he had been forced to listen to the lies the church told about his brothers. But as he was led out toward the island known as the Isle des Joues, he did not look like a man who had been broken. He walked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his bare feet hitting the cobblestones with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should. To the American or Tier 1 audience seeking deep historical layers, de Molay's appearance was a psychological shock to the crowd. He was 80 years old, yet he stood straighter than the soldiers who guarded him. His eyes, those wide, unblinking Templar eyes, looked through the crowds of commoners and the ranks of the nobility. Seeing only the void he had spent his life studying, King Philip the Fair watched from the windows of his palace. His face a mask of cold iron, he had achieved his goal. The order was dissolved. The lands were seized. The wealth, though he could not find it all, was under his control. But as he looked at the old man approaching the pyre, the king felt a sudden, inexplicable coldness in his marrow. He realized that de Molay was not afraid. And in the world of kings, there is nothing more terrifying than a man who cannot be threatened by death. The pyre was built of green wood and seasoned oak, designed to burn slowly. The church wanted de Molay to have plenty of time to reconsider his final stance. They wanted a public recantation. They wanted him to scream for the mercy of the God they represented. But the Grand Master had moved beyond the God of the church long ago. He was an initiate of the second gospel. He knew that the fire was not an end, but a catalyst for the calcination of his spirit. As they bound him to the stake, de Molay asked for one thing, that his hands be left free and that he be turned to face the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The guards, unnerved by his calm, granted the request. He stood there, a silhouette against the gray stone of the city, his white tunic fluttering in the wind. He looked like a statue from the architecture of absence that had finally come to life. The atmosphere on the island was one of suffocating tension. The crowd was silent. Even the birds seemed to have vanished from the sky. The only sound was the lapping of the water against the shore and the heavy breathing of the executioner as he approached with the torch. This was the moment where the moral decay of the 1400s reached its absolute peak. The state and the church were about to commit a murder to protect a lie, and the universe was watching when the torch touched the base of the pyre. The smoke that rose was not black, but a strange, translucent gray. It smelled of ozone and ancient dust, the same scent the knights had reported in the tunnels beneath Jerusalem. As the heat began to rise, Jacques de Molay began to speak. He did not speak in French or Latin, he spoke in the low, resonant frequency that the Templars had practiced in their circular chapls. It was the sound of the void. It was a vibration that bypassed the ears and hit the chest of every person standing on the banks of the river. The spectators began to feel a sense of profound disorientation. Some reported that the towers of Notre Dame seemed to lean toward the fire. Others said the river stopped flowing. For the duration of the speech de Molay was performing the final ritual of the order. He was using the energy of his own dissolution to project the secret into the atmosphere. He told the gathered crowd that the world was a prison, and that the king and the pope were merely the jailers of a dying reality. He said that the nothing they had found was not a threat, but the only true freedom. To the informative mind, this is the ultimate subversion of power. The Grand Master was taking the most extreme form of state violence and turning it into a platform for his message. He was showing the world that once the fear of death is removed, the power of the state vanishes. The king, watching from his window, began to tremble. He saw that the flames were not consuming de Molay's dignity. They were magnifying it. The moral decay of the king's heart was now visible in his physical reaction. Philip the Fair had spent his life accumulating power, but in the face of a man who was willingly dissolving into the void, he felt like a beggar. He ordered the guards to add more wood, to make the fire hotter, to drown out the voice. But the sound of the void cannot be drowned out. It is the background noise of the universe. De Molay's skin began to blister, but his expression remained unchanged. He was practicing the static soul to the very end. He was looking into the rose window of the cathedral across the water, seeing the central void that he and his masons had carved into the stone. He was aligning his consciousness with the architecture of the city he had helped to build. Then, as the fire reached its peak, he turned his gaze directly toward the king's palace. The Templar stare was now reinforced by the radiance of the flames. He raised his hands, and the voice that came out of him was no longer human. It was a roar of silence. "Pope Clement!" he cried out, his voice cutting through the crackle of the wood like a diamond through glass. "King Philip, within a year I summon you both to appear before the judgment of the void. You have betrayed the truth. You have protected the lie. And now the silence will claim you." This was the famous curse of the Templars, but it was not a magical spell in the traditional sense. It was a psychological and biological anchor. By speaking these words from the center of his own destruction, de Molay was creating a resonance that the king and the pope could not escape. He was infecting their minds with the absence. He was ensuring that every time they closed their eyes, they would see the gray smoke and the unblinking eyes of the man they had murdered. The psychological toll on the king was immediate. He turned away from the window, his face pale, and vomited. He felt as if a piece of the void had been planted in his own stomach. The Pope, hundreds of miles away in Avignon, reportedly suffered a seizure at the exact moment de Molay spoke the curse. The frequency of the void had traveled through the collective psyche of Europe. Reaching the men who had ordered the censorship, the crowd on the island began to panic. They realized they were witnessing something far more dangerous than an execution. They were witnessing the birth of a haunting. The moral decay of the institutions of power had finally triggered a response from the void itself. The nothing was no longer a secret. It was a curse. As the fire finally consumed the last of Jacques de Molay's physical form, the gray smoke drifted across the Seine and settled over the city like a shroud. The spectators dispersed in a terrifying silence. No one spoke of what they had seen. But the memory of the voice and the curse remained in the air, a vibration that would not go away. The year that followed was one of the darkest in the history of the French monarchy. The year of the curse began almost immediately. Pope Clement V was the first to go. He died a month later, his body wasted away by a mysterious illness that his doctors could not name. They said it felt as if his organs were simply dissolving, turning into a clear, salt-smelling fluid. In his final hours, he screamed that he could see Demale standing at the foot of his bed, holding a leaden scroll. King Philip the Fair followed him in November. He was a man in the prime of his life, but after the execution, he became a shadow of himself. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He was obsessed with the idea that the Templars had stolen his soul and taken it into the fire with them. He died during a hunting trip, but not from an accident. His heart simply stopped beating, as if it had forgotten the rhythm of life. To the American or Tier 1 audience, this is the ultimate historical vibe check. The power of the order was not in their swords, but in their ability to manipulate the reality of those who opposed them. The curse was the final act of a group of men who had realized that if the world is a mistake, then the people who think they own it are the biggest mistake of all. The moral decay of the French royal line was total. Within a decade, all of Philip's sons were dead, and the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, came to an end. The curse of the Grand Master had wiped out the bloodline of the man who had tried to censor the truth. The void had balanced the books. As you lie here in the growing dark, consider the fire that Jacques de Molay entered. It was a fire that burned away the lies of the 14th century and left behind a silence that we are still trying to fill. The Grand Master didn't lose that day. He achieved the ultimate alchemical collapse. He became one with the absence, and in doing so, he became immortal. The candle in our chamber is flickering its final rhythm. The warmth of the story is fading into the cool, steady pressure of the night. The curse is spoken. The king is gone. The pope is silent. But the smoke of that pyre is still drifting through the hallways of our history. It is the scent of a secret that refused to stay buried. The nothing that the Templars discovered is not a distant memory. It is the static between the stations. It is the quiet in the center of the cathedral. It is the feeling you get when you realize that the world is much larger and much emptier than you were ever told. The fire is out. The island is empty. The river flows on. But as you drift into the silence of sleep, the curse of the Grand Master is still echoing in the deep parts of your mind. It is a reminder that the truth cannot be burned. It can only be transformed. In our next chapter, we will move beyond the ashes and into the moral decay of the inner circle. We will look at the secret journals of the knights who survived the arrests. The men who fled into the shadows and began to build a new world based on the nothing they had saved from the flames. The execution was not the end of the order, it was the beginning of their most dangerous transformation yet. Something is rising from the smoke, and it has no name. The greatest crime of the Holy See was not the execution of the Templars, but the absolute murder of the truth that followed. To save the institution of the Church, the Vatican had to perform a total spiritual lobotomy on the Western world. They did not just burn men. They burned the very memory of a different reality. The discovery of the second gospel, the proof of the great void found beneath Jerusalem, meant that every prayer ever uttered and every coin ever tithed was a hollow gesture directed at an empty sky. Faced with this existential threat, the Pope and his cardinals made a pact of silence that would lead to 700 years of systemic moral decay. They chose to become a machine of censorship, creating a history that was a carefully curated lie to ensure the masses never looked into the abyss the Knights had uncovered. This betrayal was the price of survival, a curse that turned the house of God into a vault for the death of information. The institutional corruption we see in the centuries of the Renaissance and the Inquisition was not an accident. It was the necessary byproduct of a core that was already rotten with the secret of the nothing. The Church stayed alive by becoming the jailer of human curiosity, and the bars of that prison were forged in the fires of Paris. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The modern world is a distant, flickering memory, and we are standing in the cold, echoing hallways of the Avignon papacy. Let your mind drift into the stillness of the 14th century, where the sound of the scratching pen is the only defense against the encroaching dark dot in the years following the destruction of the Templars. A strange silence fell over the scriptoria of Europe. In the great monasteries of France and Italy, monks were given a new and terrifying task. They were no longer asked to illuminate the Word of God. They were asked to scrape it away. This was the era of the Great Palimpsest, where thousands of ancient manuscripts were scrubbed clean of their original ink to make room for a revised history. The Church realized that the nothing found by the Knights was a contagion that could only be stopped by the total erasure of its origins. The Pope, Clement V, and his successors lived in a state of permanent psychological siege. To an American or Tier 1 audience, imagine an organization that discovers its foundational documents are fraudulent, and instead of admitting the error, it decides to rewrite every library in the world to match the fraud. This was the moral decay of the Holy See. They had traded their role as shepherds of the soul for a new role as the architects of a collective illusion. The cost of this secret was immediate and profound. Because the core of the papacy was now a lie, the leadership became increasingly detached from the spiritual needs of the people. If the afterlife was a void, as the Templars claimed and the secret transcripts proved, then the only thing that mattered in the present was power and wealth. The Avignon papacy became a center of unprecedented luxury and corruption. The cardinals wore silks that cost more than entire villages, and the halls of the papal palace rang with the sound of counting coins. Rather than singing hymns, they were distracting themselves from the secret. They were building a world of gold to hide the fact that they no longer believed in the light. This is the psychological root of the systemic rot that would eventually lead to the Reformation. The Church had lost its moral compass because it had looked at the map of the void and realized it had nowhere to go. The moral decay of the Church manifested as a vast, invisible machinery of censorship. The Vatican secret archives, as we know them today, were shaped during this period of panic. Documents were classified not because they were holy, but because they were dangerous to the survival of the institution. The unspoken charges from the Templar trials were placed in lead-lined boxes, not to preserve them, but to contain the vibration of the void they carried. The Church began to promote a version of Christianity that was increasingly focused on fear and external rituals. Since the inner truth was an empty hall, they had to make the outer walls as terrifying as possible. This was the birth of the obsessed focus on purgatory and the selling of indulgences. If the Pope knew there was nothing on the other side, he could sell people a ticket to a heaven he knew didn't exist. It was the ultimate spiritual scam, a moral failure so vast it redefined the relationship between man and the divine dot to the informative mind. This period marks the transition from a church of faith to a church of management. The cardinals became the first information officers of the Western world. They tracked the flow of heretical ideas with the same precision the Templars had used to track gold. Any mention of the nothing, any whisper of the second gospel, was met with the swiftest and most brutal response. They weren't fighting for the soul of the heretic. They were fighting for the stability of the lie. In the dark hours of the night, the popes of the 14th century were reportedly haunted by the Templar stare. They felt the absence in their own chapels. It is said that Clement V, on his deathbed, refused to receive the last rites. He knew that the bread and the wine were just bread and wine. He had read the transcripts. He had seen the diagrams of the unmade soul. He died in a state of profound, cold despair, a victim of the very secret he had tried to burn. The moral decay also affected the architecture of the church's influence. They began to build their structures with a new kind of defensive psychology. They moved away from the architecture of absence that the Templars had pioneered, fearing its resonance. Instead, they built heavy, Baroque monuments to their own power, trying to use the sheer weight of the stone to crush the silence of the void. But the silence is patient. It does not mind being buried. As you lie there in the quiet, consider the weight of a secret that requires the rewriting of 1,000 years of history. Every time a priest told a grieving mother that her child was in the arms of the angels, he was participating in the moral decay of an institution that knew better. The church had become a theater of shadows, and the actors were starting to forget their lines. The corruption spread to the universities and the courts. The church controlled the flow of knowledge, ensuring that science and philosophy never touched the borders of the nothing. They created an intellectual ceiling that would take centuries to break. They were protecting the concept of heaven, but in doing so, they were starving the human mind of its natural curiosity. They had turned the search for truth into a crime against the state. By the time of the Renaissance, the moral decay of the Holy See was so complete that it was no longer even hidden. The Borgia and Medici popes were the final fruit of the seed planted during the Templar trials. They lived as secular princes, surrounded by art and violence, because they knew that the spiritual authority they claimed was a void. They were the masters of a hollow kingdom, and they played their roles with a cynical brilliance that still fascinates historians today. They used the wealth of the church to commission masterpieces that we admire in the Vatican museums, but those paintings were often paid for with the silence of the void. The beauty was a distraction from the absence. The grander the cathedral, the deeper the secret it was designed to hide. The institutional corruption was a survival mechanism. They had to keep the world looking at the gilded ceiling so they wouldn't notice the floor was missing. The secret of the Templars had become a ghost that lived in the walls of the Vatican. It influenced the way the church handled every crisis, from the Black Death to the rise of science. Their first instinct was always to hide, to censor, and to delete. They had become so practiced at lying about the nothing that they forgot how to speak the truth about anything else. The moral decay was not a phase. It was the new permanent identity of the Holy See. As we sit in the cooling embers of our story, we must ask ourselves, what is the price of a lie that lasts 700 years? The Templars were burned to protect a concept of heaven that the Church itself no longer believed in. The history of the Western world was distorted to ensure that the nothing remained in the shadows. We are the children of that distortion. We live in a reality that was edited by a group of terrified, Men in the 14th century, the candle is flickering its final rhythm. The warmth of the fire is fading into the cool, steady pressure of the night. The moral decay of the Holy See is not a story from the past. It is the foundation of the world we see around us. The silence that the Knights discovered is still there, waiting in the margins of our books and in the quiet of our own hearts. The Knights are gone. The king is ash. The Pope is a memory. But the secret of the void is still breathing. It is the static in our communications. It is the cold air in the basement of the cathedral. It is the feeling that there is something missing from our history, a piece of the puzzle that was taken away before we were born. The price of the secret was the soul of the church. And as the night settles over the stone walls of Avignon and the marble halls of Rome, the silence is the only thing that remains true. The void has no need for lies, and it has no need for kings. It only needs the dark. The scripts are finished. The ink is dry. The void is still. But as the shadows settle over you, you realize that the story is not quite over. The Knights did not all die in the fires of Paris. Some of them carried the secret to the edges of the world, to a place where the church's reach was short and the silence was deep. In our next chapter, we will follow the survivors across the cold northern seas to the echo in Rosslyn Chapel. We will discover how the architecture of absence was reborn in the mists of Scotland, and how a new generation of keepers began to prepare for the day when the silence would finally be heard by everyone. The secret has left the Vatican, and it is moving toward the future. While the fires were being lit in Paris, 18 ships slipped out of the harbor of La Rochelle under the cover of a moonless sky. They did not carry gold, and they did not carry the relics of saints. They carried the source of the fire itself, the scrolls of the second gospel, and the men who had learned how to live without a soul. This was the ultimate betrayal of King Philip's trap. He thought he had cornered the void, but it had already migrated to the jagged, mist-covered coasts of Scotland. In the shadows of the north, the secret did not just survive. It evolved. The Sinclair family, the hereditary guardians of the Forbiddance, began the construction of a stone vault that the world would come to know as Rosslyn Chapel. This was not a place of worship, but a library of the abyss, a map of the non-place carved into the very ribs of the earth. The moral decay that had rotted the heart of France was now being etched into the cold limestone of the Highlands, ensuring that the curse of the Grand Master would resonate through the centuries. Every pillar and every archway was a coordinate in a geography of absence, a secret buried in plain sight beneath the feet of an unsuspecting world. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The modern world has faded into the gray mist of the Atlantic, and we are standing on the edge of a wooded glen in the year 1446. Let your mind drift into the stillness of the Scottish winter, where the wind whispers through the ruins of a history that was never meant to be read by the uninitiated. The journey from the warmth of France to the biting cold of the Midlothian hills was more than a physical distance. For the surviving Templars, it was a descent into the true heart of their philosophy. Scotland was a land outside the reach of the Pope's immediate iron grip, a place where the shadows were long and the people were accustomed to secrets. It was here, in the ancestral lands of the St. Clair family, that the Nothing found its new sanctuary. William St. Clair, the third Earl of Orkney, was a man of immense intellect and terrifying focus. To the outside world, He was a powerful noble building a collegiate church for the glory of God. But to the initiates who arrived at his door, he was the new Grand Master of the Silence. He understood that the architecture of absence that had failed in the great cathedrals of Europe needed to be compressed. It needed to be hidden in a space so complex and so strange that the mind would lose itself before it could find the truth. Imagine the sound of the hammers in the glen of Roslin. It was a constant rhythmic pulse that lasted for 40 years. The masons who worked here were not the usual guilds. They were the descendants of the children of Solomon, the men who had carved the rose windows of France. They were brought to Scotland in secret, living in a closed community where the only language spoken was the geometry of the void, the atmospheric build of. Roslin Chapel is unique in the history of architecture. It is tiny compared to the giants of Notre Dame or Chartres, yet it is more densely packed with information than any other building on earth. Every square inch of the stone is covered in carvings. To a Tier 1 audience, this is the ultimate information overflow. The chapel is designed to overwhelm the senses, to create a psychological state where the viewer stops looking for a single meaning and begins to feel the weight of the nothing behind the symbols. As you walk through the small stone doorway, the air changes. It becomes heavy and cold, smelling of damp earth and something ancient that has never seen the sun. The light does not pour in. It struggles. The windows are narrow, and the interior is crowded with pillars that look like frozen trees. This is the forest of the void, a physical representation of the tangled, dark path the soul must take to reach the great absence. The moral decay of this sanctuary was hidden in its very beauty. The St. Clairs used the wealth they had salvaged from the order to buy the silence of the local clergy. The priests who conducted the Mass at Roslin were forbidden from entering certain parts of the building at night. They were told that the chapel was a private reliquary, but they knew that the prayers spoken within those walls did not sound like any Latin they had ever heard. The echo in Roslin is not a metaphor. The chapel was built with a specific acoustic resonance. The curves of the roof and the hollows of the pillars were designed to capture the sound of the wind from the glen and turn it into a low, continuous hum. This is the frequency of the void. If you sit in the silence of the chapel for long enough, you begin to realize that the building is breathing. It is a stone machine designed to keep the secret alive. Vibrating in the shadows of the medieval world. The center of the mystery at Roslin is the apprentice pillar. It is a masterpiece of stone carving. A single column wrapped in 4 spiraling vines of exquisite detail. The legend tells us that the master mason went to Rome to study the design, and while he was gone, his apprentice finished the pillar. When the master returned and saw the superior work, he killed the apprentice in a fit of jealous rage, but for the Lore Slumber Collective, the legend is a mask. The master and the apprentice are symbols for the church and the secret order. The pillar is the world tree, but it is a tree that is being strangled by the vines of the void. The spiraling design is a mathematical representation of the great loop, the cycle of existence that the Templars sought to break. The apprentice was killed not for his skill, but because he had finished the secret. He had revealed the nothing too clearly in the stone. At the base of the pillar are carved dragons. Their mouths open as they gnaw at the roots of the tree. These are not the dragons of mythology. They are the eaters of the soul, the forces of the void that consume the accident of life. The pillar is a coordinate in the map of the non-place, a physical anchor for the frequency of the abyss. To the informative mind, The most shocking part of Rosslyn is what is carved around the windows. There are carvings of maize and aloes, plants that were not discovered by the Western world until Columbus reached the Americas 50 years after the chapel was built. How did the Sinclair Masons know the shape of these forbidden plants? The answer lies in the ships of the void. The Templars were not just masters of the land. They were masters of the sea and the stars. They had found the maps to the other side of the physical world long before the rest of Europe. They traveled to the New World not to conquer it, but to find another place where the silence was deep. The maze at Rosslyn is a signature, a proof that the secret had no borders. It was a declaration that the Church's reality was a small, fragile bubble in a much larger, emptier universe. The psychological layer of Rosslyn is one of profound isolation. When you stand near the apprentice pillar, you feel a sense of being watched from within the stone. The hundreds of green men carved into the walls, their faces twisted in leafy agony, are the witnesses of the absence. They are the souls that have been unmade by the secret. Their identities absorbed back into the silence. The moral decay of the Sinclair line was their acceptance of this role. They were the lords of the shadow. They lived in a world of fine tapestries and roaring fires, but their true life was spent in the cold damp of the chapel. They were the protectors of a truth that they knew would eventually consume them. They were living without a soul, just like the knights who had fled France. Their lives dedicated to a nothing that offered no reward but the silence itself. As you lie there, imagine the wind howling through the glen of Rosslyn. It hits the stone walls and is transformed into that low, steady hum. The chapel is a lighthouse for the void, sending out a signal that only those with the Templar eyes can see. It is a place where the rules of the medieval world did not apply. Within these walls there was no king, no pope, and no heaven. There was only the stone, the frequency, and the absence. Why did they build it here, so far from the centers of power? Because the void needs space to resonate. It needs the quiet of the wilderness to be heard. Rosslyn was the 0 point of the north, a laboratory where the secret survived the centuries of institutional corruption that followed the arrests. It was a time capsule of the second gospel, waiting for the day when the world would be ready to look at the nothing and not blink. Beneath the floor of Rosslyn Chapel lies the great crypt. It has been sealed for centuries, and the current guardians of the chapel refuse to open it. The local legends say it contains 20 knights in full armor sitting in a circle waiting for a signal. But the secret transcripts of the Lore Slumber archives tell a different story. The crypt is not a tomb. It is a continuation of the architecture of absence. It is a chamber of pure sensory deprivation, a place where the survivors of the order went to complete their alchemical collapse. They were not waiting for a war. They were waiting for the dissolution of the self. They were unmaking their bodies in the dark, turning themselves into the same clear, salt-smelling fluid that had been reported in the trials. The moral decay of the secret is its final demand, the total surrender of the physical. The knights in the crypt did not die. They simply stopped being. They left behind their armor and their swords as empty shells while their consciousness entered the great absence. This is why the crypt must remain sealed. It is not to protect the dead, but to protect the living from the frequency of the void that still pulses within that. Subterranean space. The echo in Rosslyn still resonates today. Visitors often report feeling a sense of overwhelming sadness or a strange, cold pressure behind their eyes when they stand in the nave. They are feeling the nothing that the Sinclairs and the Templars anchored there. The chapel is a stone ghost, a reminder that the truth cannot be destroyed by fire, only moved into the shadows. The church tried to erase the Templars from history, but they forgot that the earth itself has memory. Rosslyn is the memory of the void, a silent witness to the betrayal of the world's reality. It is the place where the unspoken charges were written in rock, ensuring that the secret would survive the fall of kings and the corruption of popes. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the stone pillars of Rosslyn. They are not supporting a roof. They are supporting a silence. They are the guardians of a non-place that is closer to you than you think. The echo is in the room with you now. It is the sound of the wind outside your window. It is the steady, quiet rhythm of your own heart. The candle is flickering its last breath. The warmth of the fire is fading into the cool night air. The chapel is dark and the glen is silent, but the frequency is still there, vibrating in the stones and in the shadows of the north. The secret has survived the fire, and it has survived the mist. It is waiting for the final act. The moment when the last candle is blown out and the nothing is all that remains. The hammer has fallen. The mason is still. The stone is carved, but the echo is not finished. The Templars left one final clue, a gesture of absolute finality that was not meant for a chapel or a cathedral, but for the entire world. A world that was built on a lie and is finally beginning to realize it. In our final chapter, we will return to the moment of the great disclosure. We will look at the unlit candle and the world that was built on the lie of the church. We will discover what happens when the frequency of Rosslyn spreads to the corners of the earth, and the nothing is finally acknowledged for what it is, the beginning and the end of all things. The candle is about to go out, and the truth is waiting in the dark. The ultimate betrayal was not the fire that consumed the Grand Master, but the silence that followed it. We are living in a world built on a foundation of carefully curated shadows. Every institution of power, every record of our past, and every prayer whispered in the dark is a part of a 700-year-old lie designed to keep you from looking into the abyss. The Knights Templar did not lose their war. They simply changed the battlefield. They moved from the physical world of swords and stone into the psychological world of thoughts and frequencies. The secret they found beneath Jerusalem, the second gospel of the void, is not a forgotten myth. It is the invisible ink on the pages of your history books. It is the reason why our world feels heavy, why the light feels fragile, and why the truth is always just out of reach. We have been taught to fear the dark, but the real curse is the false light we have used to hide the nothingness. The Vatican and the king believed they had buried the secret, but they only served to plant it in the soil of our collective subconscious. The moral decay of the modern world is the final blooming of that ancient seed. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years for the last time. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn against the world, and the only sound is the rhythmic heartbeat of a dying fire. Let your mind drift into the absolute stillness of the present moment, where the past and the future meet in a single, unlit candle. We have traveled through the tunnels of Jerusalem and the dungeons of France. We have stood in the circular chapels of the north and watched the smoke rise from the pyre on the Seine. But as we reach the end of our journey, we realize that the story has no resolution. The Knights Templar did not vanish. They dissolved into the structure of the world we inhabit. To an American or Tier 1 audience, the concept of a systemic lie is not new. But the depth of this historical cover-up is something that defies modern understanding. History tells us that the order was destroyed in 1312. But history is a narrative written by the survivors of the moral decay. The truth is that the nothing the Knights discovered was so powerful that it forced the Church to create a second, artificial reality to contain it. We are living in that artificial reality. Every time you look at a clock, every time you use a currency, and every time you seek meaning in a system of governance, you are interacting with the cage, the Vatican, built to hide the void. The unlit candle is the symbol of this final realization. It is a candle that has never been lit because if it were, the light would reveal that the room is empty. The Templars knew this. They understood that the greatest power is not in the flame, but in the potential of the dark. They chose to remain unlit, to become the silent ghosts in the machinery of Western civilization. They realized that a secret that is spoken can be burned. But a secret that is lived becomes indestructible. The institutional corruption that began in the 14th century did not end with the fall of the papacy in Avignon. It evolved into what we now call consensus reality. The Church realized that you do not need to burn heretics if you can convince them that the truth does not exist. They replaced the second gospel with a theology of material desire and spiritual fear. They taught us that we are small, that we are sinful, and that we are separate from the infinite silence. The moral decay of this system is evident in the way we treat the world. Because we are taught that the other side is a place of judgment or a place of reward, we have forgotten how to be present in the absence. The Templars were the first to master the art of living without a soul, not because they were evil, but because they had found something larger than the individual self. They had found the 0 point, where the human and the void are one dot as you lie there in the quiet. Consider the weight of the historical deletion we have discussed. Imagine all the books that were never written, the discoveries that were never shared, and the lives that were erased to protect the concept of heaven. We are the descendants of a lobotomist culture. We are the survivors of a spiritual plague that taught us to be afraid of our own depth. The nothing is not a vacuum. It is the source of all potential. But the Church turned it into a monster to keep us from reaching for it. The architecture of our modern city still reflects this struggle. The glass towers of the financial districts are the heirs to the architecture of absence, but they have forgotten the secret. They are hollow without being empty. They are built to reflect the light, but they have no relationship with the shadow. The Templars would look at our world and see a desert of noise, a place where the frequency of the void has been, drowned out by the static of consumption, the information we have gathered from the secret transcripts. And the hidden carvings suggest that the Knights were waiting for a specific moment in time. They were waiting for a day when the collective lie would become so heavy that it would collapse under its own weight. They called this the Great Unmaking. We are living in the tremors of that collapse. The moral decay of our institutions is not a sign of the end. It is a sign of the reveal. The nothing is starting to leak back into the world. We see it in the growing existential dread that haunts the modern mind. We see it in the way our traditional stories no longer satisfy us. We are starting to remember the silence. We are starting to feel the vibration of the obsidian chamber in our own hearts. The Templars were not just keepers of a secret, they were the pioneers of a future that we are only now starting to inhabit. They were the ones who dared to look into the void and say, I am this. The secret did not die with the Knights because a secret of that magnitude cannot be killed. It is a biological frequency. It is etched into the geometry of our DNA. The Templars used their alchemy to transform their own bloodlines into vessels for the void. They married into the noble families of Europe. They founded the secret societies that would later shape the Enlightenment, and they ensured that their negative theology would always have a place in the shadows of the intellectual world. The moral decay of the Holy See was a necessary part of the plan. By forcing the Church to become corrupt, the Templars ensured that the people would eventually look for another way. They knew that a religion built on a lie cannot stand forever. They were playing the long game, a game of centuries and civilizations. They were the masters of the unlit candle, waiting for the darkness to become absolute so that the smallest light would be seen by everyone. Think of the silence of a deep forest at night. The way the trees seem to lean in, listening to a sound that you cannot hear. That is the feeling of the secret. It is a presence that does not need words. It is an information density that is so high it feels like nothingness. When you stand in the ruins of a Templar commandery or in the nave of Rosslyn Chapel, you are not looking at history. You are looking at a mirror. The price of the secret was the sacrifice of the order's reputation and the lives of its leaders. But to men who had seen the void, reputation and life were trivialities. They were the first true cosmic citizens, men who understood that their physical existence was just a brief flicker in an eternal silence. They accepted the curse of the Grand Master as a mantle of power. They accepted the fire as a final alchemical step, and what of us, the listeners in the dark? We are the final participants in the ritual. By hearing this story, by following the curiosity ladder into the depths of the void, you are becoming a part of the absence. You are learning to see the world as the Knights saw it. You are starting to notice the symbols of the void in your own life. The secret is being read again, not from a leaden scroll, but from the echoes in your own mind. The institutional corruption of our world is the proof that the secret is still working. The lie is becoming so transparent that we can see the void through the cracks. The unlit candle is waiting for your hand. But remember the warning of the second gospel. The light does not reveal the path. It only reveals the cage. The path is found in the dark. The story of the Templars is the story of a world that is finally waking up to its own emptiness. It is a slow, hypnotic realization that the gold, the crowns, and the cathedrals were all just distractions to keep us from the truth. The moral decay of the 1400s was the beginning of our liberation. It was the moment we realized that the jailers were just as trapped as the prisoners. As you lie here, feel the space around you. Feel the silence of the room. It is the same silence that filled the tunnels beneath Jerusalem. It is the same silence that Jacques de Molay carried into the fire. It is a silence that is perfect, eternal, and profoundly informative. It tells you that you are not a mistake, but a part of the original nothing. You are the void experiencing itself through a body of dust. The Templars have finished their work. They have built the cathedrals, they have carved the maps, and they have spoken the curse. They have left the unlit candle in your hands. The secret is no longer buried. It is everywhere. It is in the air you breathe and in the space between your thoughts. The file is not being closed because the story is over. It is being closed because you are now a part of the story. The Church tried to protect the concept of heaven, but they only succeeded in creating a world that is obsessed with the end. The Templars, however, found the end and discovered that it was a beginning. They found that the other side is not a place you go when you die, but a place you inhabit while you are alive. They found the peace that passes all understanding because they understood that there is nothing to understand. The fire on the Seine has gone out. The ships from La Rochelle have vanished into the mist. The masons of Roslin have laid down their tools. The world built on a lie is still standing, but it is shivering in the cold wind of the void. The nothing is patient. It has all the time in the world. It is waiting for the last institutional wall to fall. It is waiting for the last lie to be spoken. You are the keeper of the unlit candle now. You are the shadow in the commandery. You are the resonance of the void. As the final echoes of this history fade into the dark, let yourself drift into the silence they fought to protect. Let yourself become the absence. There is no more need for words. There is no more need for light. The truth is here, in the quiet, in the cool, and in the deep. The moral decay is finished. The secret is told. The cycle is complete. The world we thought we knew is just a memory, a flickering image on the wall of a cave. Outside, the great silence is calling. It is a home we never truly left. It is a peace we have always known. Sleep now. The file is closed.